There are places on this earth where stone meets silence, where ancient hands carved worlds we still can't explain. 7 sites, 7 civilizations, each one defying what we thought we knew about our ancestors. Tonight, we're going to walk through ruins that challenge the very timeline of human achievement. Some were built without the wheel, others without written language. A few seem to have required knowledge that shouldn't have existed yet. These aren't legends or folklore. These are real places you can visit tomorrow. And after decades of study, we still can't answer the simplest question. How? The stones are there. The evidence is undeniable. But the truth? That remains buried somewhere between what we can prove and what seems impossible. Welcome to 7 archaeological mysteries that shouldn't exist. The cliff face rises nearly 100 feet above the Verde Valley floor in central Arizona. And there, pressed into a natural limestone alcove, sits a structure that doesn't belong. 20 rooms, 5 stories, built sometime around 1100 AD by people we now call the Sinagua. But here's what stops archaeologists cold. These aren't ruins in the traditional sense. The walls are still standing. The mortar still holds. After 900 years of wind, rain, and desert heat, Montezuma Castle remains almost perfectly intact. The early settlers who found it assumed only the Aztecs could have built something so impressive. They named it after Montezuma, though he lived hundreds of miles south and wouldn't be born for another 3 centuries. The mistake stuck, but the real mystery isn't who built it, it's how they built it, and more importantly, why they left. The Sinagua people appeared in this region around 600 AD. They farmed the valley below, hunted the surrounding hills, and at some point decided to move their homes into the cliffs. Not just Montezuma Castle, dozens of cliff dwellings dot this valley, but Montezuma Castle is the crown jewel. The construction is remarkable. Hand-cut limestone blocks fitted together with mud mortar. Wooden beams, some spanning 12 feet, somehow hoisted 90 feet up a sheer cliff face. No evidence of scaffolding, no clear path up the rock, just smooth limestone, and near the top, this intricate dwelling that would make modern builders nervous. The rooms inside are small, but deliberately designed. Some stored food, others were living spaces. There's evidence of a sophisticated ventilation system. The structure stays cool in summer, warm in winter. The southern exposure maximizes sunlight during the shorter days. These people understood passive solar design 700 years before we had a term for it. But here's where the story gets complicated. Around 1425 AD, the Sinagua vanished, not just from Montezuma Castle, from the entire Verde Valley. They left behind tools, pottery, even food stores. They left these incredible dwellings that had protected them for generations, and they walked away. The prevailing theory blames drought. Tree ring data shows a significant dry period, starting in the early 1400s. The Salt River, which fed their irrigation systems, would have dwindled. Crops would have failed. But other cultures endured droughts. They adapted, moved to water sources, or changed what they grew. The Sinagua didn't. They disappeared so completely that we don't even know their real name. Sinagua is Spanish, without water, a label applied centuries later. Some researchers point to the Hopi and Yavapai tribes, suggesting the Sinagua merged with these groups. There are cultural similarities, shared pottery styles, religious motifs that overlap. But there's no direct evidence, No oral histories that say, yes, we came from the Verde Valley. Just architectural ghosts and unanswered questions. The construction techniques raise their own mysteries. Modern engineers have studied the site, trying to determine how the Sinagua moved materials up that cliff. The most common theory involves rope ladders and human chains, passing stones hand to hand. It's possible, but exhausting. Each limestone block weighs between 50 and 80 pounds. The wooden beams are heavier, and all of it had to go up that cliff multiple times over several years of construction. Then there's the question of defense. Why build so high if you're not protecting against something? The height makes sense as a fortress, but the Sinagua weren't known as a warrior culture. There's no evidence of warfare in the Verde Valley during their time. No massacres, no burned settlements, no mass graves. So what were they defending against? Or were they simply observing something? Maybe the valley itself, the movement of game, the changing of seasons. Recent excavations have added one more puzzle. Analysis of the mortar shows it contains calcium carbonate from a source miles away, not the local limestone. Someone made a deliberate choice to import materials. That suggests planning, organization, and a reason we haven't identified. You don't carry heavy materials across a desert valley unless it matters. Today, Montezuma Castle is a national monument. You can't climb up anymore. Too much damage from a century of tourists. But you can stand at the base and look up at those windows, those doorways carved into the cliff. And you can ask the same questions archaeologists have been asking for 100 years. Who were these people really? What did they know that we've forgotten? And where did they go when they finally closed those doors for the last time? In the highlands of southern Africa, walls rise from the earth like the bones of giants. They're not Roman, not Greek, not built by any empire that appears in European history books. These are the Cyclopean walls, massive stone barriers constructed without mortar, stretching across hundreds of miles of terrain that most of the world forgot existed until the 20th century. The term Cyclopean comes from ancient Greece. It described walls so massive that later Greeks believed only the Cyclops, the one-eyed giants of mythology, could have moved the stones. When European explorers found similar walls in Africa, they borrowed the name. But they refused to believe Africans built them. That prejudice delayed serious archaeology by decades. Early colonizers insisted the walls must be Phoenician, or perhaps the work of the biblical Queen of Sheba. Anything except the obvious truth, that indigenous African societies possessed engineering knowledge that rivaled anything in the ancient Mediterranean. The walls appear across multiple sites, but the most impressive examples are in Zimbabwe, Botswana, and South Africa. Some stand 15 feet high. Individual stones weigh several tons. They're fitted together with a precision that makes you wonder how anyone achieved it without modern tools. No mortar means no room for error. Each stone had to be shaped, positioned, and locked into place so perfectly that gravity alone would hold the structure for centuries. Great Zimbabwe gets the most attention. We'll come to that later. But there are older walls, less famous ones scattered across the landscape. Some encircle what were clearly cattle kraals. Others seem to mark territorial boundaries. A few have no obvious purpose at all. They simply exist, running along ridge lines or cutting across valleys, directing the eye toward horizons that held meaning we can no longer decipher. The construction technique is consistent Across sites, builders selected granite or dolomite, hard stones that don't erode easily. They split the rock along natural fracture lines, creating roughly rectangular blocks. Then came the fitting. Each stone was placed, adjusted, removed, shaped further, and replaced until it locked with its neighbors. The walls taper slightly as they rise, providing structural stability. The best examples show a double wall construction with rubble fill between, a technique that distributes weight and prevents collapse. But here's what puzzles engineers. Many of these walls were built on slopes, not gentle hills, steep inclines where modern contractors would insist on foundations and rebar. The ancient builders used neither. They simply started at the bottom and worked upward, letting each course of stone support the next. Physics says it shouldn't work, but the walls are still standing. Dating these structures has proven difficult. Stone doesn't decay like wood or organic material. You can't carbon date granite. Archaeologists have to rely on associated artifacts, pottery shards, tool fragments, ash from ancient fires. That evidence suggests construction began around 1000 AD, maybe earlier. Some sites show continuous building and rebuilding over 5 centuries. Communities return to these walls generation after generation, adding sections, repairing damage, maintaining structures that clearly held deep significance. The cultural context is equally fascinating. The walls don't appear in isolation. They're part of larger settlements that included housing, storage facilities, and elaborate drainage systems. These weren't primitive villages. They were sophisticated societies with specialized labor, long-distance trade networks, and social hierarchies. Archaeologists have found gold artifacts, copper ingots, glass beads from India, and Chinese porcelain at multiple sites. These people were connected to the wider world, centuries before Europeans arrived. So, why don't we know more? Part of the problem is colonial history. When Europeans encountered these walls, many were still in use. Local communities maintained them, incorporated them into current settlements. But colonial governments often relocated populations, disrupted traditional practices, and dismissed oral histories as unreliable. Knowledge that had been passed down for generations was suddenly cut off. Modern archaeology is trying to recover that lost information. Researchers are working with local communities, recording oral traditions, and using new technologies like LIDAR to map wall systems hidden by vegetation. What they're finding suggests the walls served multiple purposes. Yes, some were defensive, but others marked sacred spaces, controlled the movement of livestock, or demonstrated political power. Building a massive stone wall required resources, organization, and authority. The wall itself was a statement. We are here. We are powerful. We will endure. Recent excavations at one site in South Africa found something unexpected. Beneath a massive wall dated to 1200 AD, archaeologists discovered remnants of an earlier structure. Same Cyclopean construction, same precision fitting, but the radiocarbon dates came back centuries older than they expected. It suggests the tradition goes back further than we thought, maybe much further. And that opens uncomfortable questions. If these societies had this level of engineering skill in 800 or 900 AD, what else did they achieve that hasn't survived? What knowledge disappeared when colonial powers disrupted these cultures? The walls are what remain, But walls don't exist in isolation. They're part of larger systems, political, economic, spiritual. We're only now beginning to understand how much we lost. 20 miles inland from the Pacific coast of Peru, the Super River Valley cuts through one of the driest deserts on Earth. And there, rising from the sand, are pyramids that shouldn't exist, not because they're impossible, but because they're too old. Caral isn't famous like Machu Picchu. It doesn't appear on tourist itineraries. For most of the 20th century, archaeologists drove past it without stopping, assuming the mounds were natural hills. Then, in 1994, Ruth Shady Solis started excavating. What she found rewrote the history of civilization in the Americas. The pyramids of Caral date to 2600 BC. That's older than the Great Pyramid of Giza. It makes Caral contemporary with the Egyptian Old Kingdom, with the Sumerian city-states, with the early dynasties of China. Except here's the problem. Caral had none of the things we associate with ancient civilizations. No pottery, no art, no weapons, no evidence of warfare at all. The site covers nearly 170 acres. There are 6 major pyramids, the largest rising nearly 80 feet. Surrounding them are residential complexes, sunken plazas, and an amphitheater that could hold hundreds of people. The construction is impressive. Massive stone walls faced with plaster, ceremonial stairways, interior rooms arranged with clear purpose. This wasn't a village, it was a city. And it existed 1,000 years before we thought cities were possible in South America. But here's what makes Caral truly strange. Everything about it is peaceful. Most ancient cities show evidence of conflict, defensive walls, weapons caches, burned buildings, mass graves. Caral has none of that. The walls aren't defensive. They're too low, too open. There's no fortification. The society that built this place either had no enemies or had developed some form of social organization that made warfare unnecessary. So what held them together? The current theory points to religion and trade. The pyramids weren't tombs. They were ceremonial centers. Excavations found elaborate fire pits, musical instruments made from animal bones, and evidence of large gatherings. The amphitheater's acoustics are remarkable. You can stand at the bottom and speak in a normal voice, and people at the top can hear you clearly. Someone understood sound engineering 4,000 years ago. The trade network is equally impressive. Caral sits between the coast and the mountains. Archaeologists have found anchovy bones, marine protein transported from the Pacific. They found cotton, grown in the valley, and traded to coastal fishing communities who used it for nets. There's evidence of goods from the highlands, obsidian, exotic stones, possibly coca leaves. Caral was a hub, controlling the flow of resources between ecological zones. But the absence of pottery is puzzling. Every other major civilization from this period made ceramics. Pottery is how we date sites, how we track trade, how we identify cultural changes. Caral had none. They used gourds instead, carved, decorated, but ultimately organic material that doesn't survive well. It's made dating the site incredibly difficult. Ruth Shady had to rely on carbon dating reed fragments from woven bags called shikra. These bags were filled with stones and used as foundation material in the pyramids. The dates came back consistent, 2600 BC, give or take a century. The construction method itself raises questions. The pyramids are built in stages, layers of stone-filled shikra bags stacked and then faced with cut stone. It's efficient, but labor-intensive. Estimates suggest it took hundreds of workers years to complete each structure. That implies social organization, a surplus economy, and some authority structure capable of mobilizing large groups for non-agricultural labor. Yet there's no evidence of kings or queens, no palaces, no royal tombs, no artifacts suggesting a ruling class. The residential areas show variation in size and quality, but nothing extreme. If Caral had leaders, they didn't advertise it the way pharaohs or emperors did. Power here might have been religious rather than political. The priests, not warriors or kings, may have been the organizing force. The end of Caral is as mysterious as its beginning. Around 1800 BC, the site was abandoned. Not destroyed, abandoned. People left in an orderly fashion, taking their belongings. Some researchers blame climate change. The region experienced a prolonged drought around that time. The Supa River would have diminished, making agriculture difficult. But Caral had survived dry periods before. Why leave entirely? One theory suggests the trade network collapsed. If Caral's power came from controlling exchange between coast and mountains, anything that disrupted those routes would undermine the city's purpose. Maybe coastal communities found other sources for cotton. Maybe highland groups established direct relationships with fishing villages. Without its role as middleman, Caral would have lost its reason to exist. Or maybe it was something simpler. Communities move, resources deplete, rivers change course. What seems mysterious to us might have been obvious to them. The land could no longer support the population, so they left. The pyramids remained because pyramids are hard to move. What frustrates archaeologists is how much we'll never know. Caral had no writing system. Everything we understand comes from physical evidence. Architecture, food remains, tools, and the layout of the city itself. We can make educated guesses about social structure, economy, and belief systems, but we're guessing. The people who built these pyramids left no explanation, no records, no voice that speaks across 4,000 years. Recent work at the site continues to surprise researchers. In 2016, excavations uncovered a residential complex with evidence of earthquake damage. Walls cracked, floors buckled, but then repaired. The people of Caral knew how to build earthquake-resistant structures. They used flexible foundations, allowed for movement in the walls, and designed buildings that could absorb seismic shocks. This is sophisticated engineering that wouldn't reappear in Peru for another 1,000 years. There's also growing evidence that Caral wasn't alone. Surveys of the Supa Valley have identified at least 20 other settlements from the same period. Most are smaller, but a few approach Caral's size. It suggests a network of related communities, possibly united by shared religious practices or economic interdependence. Caral might have been the ceremonial center, but it was part of something larger. A civilization we're only beginning to understand. The biggest question remains, why here? The Supa Valley isn't particularly hospitable. The climate is harsh, water is scarce, and the soil requires intensive management. Yet this is where one of the world's oldest cities emerged, not in a river delta like Mesopotamia, not along a major waterway like the Nile or Indus, but in a narrow valley on the edge of a desert, built by people who somehow made it work. The stone walls rise 30 feet high, curving in elegant arcs that follow the natural contours of the hill. They're made from granite blocks, fitted without mortar each stone carefully selected and placed so that the structure would stand for centuries. This is Great Zimbabwe, and for a long time, the rest of the world refused to believe Africans built it. The site covers nearly 1,800 acres in southeastern Zimbabwe. There are three main areas: the hill complex, perched on a granite outcrop with commanding views of the valley; the great enclosure below, with its massive curved wall; and the valley ruins between them, where most people lived. At its peak, somewhere between 1200 and 1450 AD, Great Zimbabwe was home to perhaps 18,000 people. It was the capital of a kingdom that controlled trade routes stretching from the Indian Ocean to the interior of Africa. When European explorers encountered the ruins in the late 1800s, they immediately began inventing alternative histories. Some claimed it was the biblical Ophir, where King Solomon's mines produced gold. Others insisted it must be Phoenician, or maybe built by Arabs. The Portuguese had records of wealthy African kingdoms in the interior, but colonial ideology couldn't accept that indigenous Africans had created something this sophisticated. It took until the 1930s for archaeology to settle the question. The ruins are African. Specifically, they were built by ancestors of the Shona people, who still live in the region. Radiocarbon dating, artifact analysis, and architectural studies all confirmed it. But the delay cost us. Early treasure hunters and amateur archaeologists damaged the site, removed artifacts without recording context, and destroyed evidence that might have answered questions we're still asking. The construction technique is remarkable. Great Zimbabwe's builders worked with granite, which naturally exfoliates into flat sheets. They quarried these sheets, shaped them into rectangular blocks, and built walls using a technique called dry stone construction. No mortar, just precisely fitted stones. The walls are double-layered with a rubble core, providing stability. Some sections show a decorative chevron pattern along the top, stones arranged in a zigzag that serves no structural purpose. It's purely aesthetic. Someone wanted these walls to be beautiful as well as functional. The great enclosure is the most impressive structure. Its outer wall is over 800 feet long and runs in a smooth, continuous curve. Inside is a conical tower, solid stone, 30 feet tall. Its purpose remains unclear. It's not hollow. There are no rooms, no stairs, no obvious function. Some researchers think it's symbolic, perhaps representing a grain bin, or connected to fertility rituals. Others believe it's simply a monument, built to demonstrate power and wealth. The hill complex is where the ruling elite lived. The position is strategic. You can see for miles in every direction. Narrow passageways wind between granite boulders, creating a maze-like entrance that would be easy to defend. Inside are platforms, enclosures, and what archaeologists call the Eastern Enclosure, where important rituals likely took place. This is where they found the famous Zimbabwe birds, 8 soapstone sculptures of birds perched on columns. These birds appear on Zimbabwe's national flag today, but their original meaning is lost. Were they totems, ancestors, gods? We don't know. What we do know is that Great Zimbabwe was wealthy. Excavations have uncovered glass beads from India and Persia, Chinese porcelain, Arab coins, and copper from mines hundreds of miles away. The kingdom traded gold, ivory, and probably iron, exporting to Swahili coastal cities that connected to the broader Indian Ocean trade network. Great Zimbabwe didn't exist in isolation. It was part of a globalized medieval economy. But here's what's strange. The site has no obvious source of water. There's no river, no spring, no wells that archaeologists have found. 18,000 people need water for drinking, cooking, agriculture, livestock. Where did it come from? The current theory suggests a system of dams and reservoirs in the surrounding hills, channeling seasonal rainfall. But if that's true, maintaining the water supply would have required constant labor and sophisticated engineering. One drought, one failed dam, and the whole system collapses, and collapse it did. Around 1450 AD, Great Zimbabwe was abandoned. The population dispersed, splitting into successor kingdoms that established new capitals to the north and south. The reasons aren't entirely clear. Climate data shows a period of reduced rainfall starting in the late 1400s. Overgrazing might have degraded the surrounding land. Supporting 18,000 people in a semi-arid environment takes a toll. The soil becomes exhausted, vegetation disappears, and eventually the land can't sustain the population. There's also an economic angle. The gold deposits in the immediate area were finite. As mines played out, the kingdom's wealth would have declined. Trade routes shifted. Coastal cities found new partners. Without gold to trade, Great Zimbabwe's political power would have weakened. People would have moved to regions with better resources, following new rulers who promised prosperity. But the archaeological evidence suggests the departure was orderly. There's no sign of conquest, no burned buildings, no massacre. People simply left, taking their valuable possessions with them. The stone walls remained, because you can't pack a wall. The structures were too massive to dismantle, too impressive to destroy. So they stood, silent, as the landscape slowly reclaimed the site. Colonial archaeologists did significant damage in their rush to prove Great Zimbabwe wasn't African. They dug without methodology, removed artifacts without recording their locations, and destroyed stratigraphic layers that might have told us about the site's development. By the time professional archaeology arrived, much of the context was lost. We can describe what Great Zimbabwe looked like, but reconstructing how it functioned, politically, economically, socially, requires more guesswork than researchers would prefer. Recent work has focused on the surrounding landscape. LiDAR surveys revealed terraced hillsides, evidence of intensive agriculture that could have supported the population. There are remnants of smaller settlements extending for miles around the main ruins, suggesting Great Zimbabwe was the center of a much larger complex. Trade goods found at these outlying sites match those from the capital, indicating an integrated economic system. One of the most intriguing discoveries came from soil analysis. Researchers found elevated levels of phosphorus and other nutrients in specific areas, chemical signatures of human habitation and livestock keeping. By mapping these signatures, archaeologists can identify where people lived, where animals were penned, and where crops were grown, even though the physical structures have long since disappeared. It's painting a more complete picture of daily life in medieval Zimbabwe. The stone birds remain the site's greatest mystery. They're carved from soapstone, relatively soft material that's easy to work. Each bird is unique, different postures, different details. They were mounted on columns in the eastern enclosure, positioned where they would have been visible during ceremonies. Some show traces of red pigment, suggesting they were painted, but what they represent is unclear. The Shona people have oral traditions about ancestral spirits, about the importance of birds as messengers between the living and the dead. The sculptures might fit into that worldview, or they might mean something else entirely, something lost when the kingdom fell and its traditions scattered. What we're left with is a monument to human ambition. Great Zimbabwe represents a society that organized itself without written language, that built monumental architecture without metal tools, that participated in global trade networks centuries before Europeans arrived in sub-Saharan Africa. And yet for decades, the world refused to believe it was possible. The ruins stood as evidence, but prejudice was stronger than stone. Today, Great Zimbabwe is a UNESCO World Heritage Site. The Zimbabwean government has invested in preservation and research. But questions remain. How exactly did the water system work? What political structure governed the kingdom? How were decisions made? Was there a king, a council, a religious authority? And perhaps most importantly, what daily life was like for the thousands of people who called this place home? The stones can tell us only so much. They speak of skill, wealth, and power. They demonstrate engineering knowledge and aesthetic sensibility. But the human voices, the stories, the songs, the arguments and celebrations, those are silent. Great Zimbabwe endures as a monument to what we've lost as much as what remains. Deep in the Guatemalan jungle, a pyramid rises 212 feet above the forest floor. It's Temple 4 at Tikal, and when it was completed around 741 AD, it was the tallest structure in the pre-Columbian Americas. Standing at the top, you can see the crowns of other temples breaking through the canopy. Temple 1, Temple 2, the great plaza far below. But mostly what you see is green, endless jungle stretching to the horizon, just as it did when this place was abandoned over 1,000 years ago. Tikal was one of the great Maya cities, home to perhaps 100,000 people at its peak. It controlled a territory spanning thousands of square miles, engaged in warfare with rival cities, and produced art and architecture that still astounds researchers today. Temple 4 was built during the reign of Yikinchan Kawil, one of Tikal's most powerful rulers. It's a monument to military victory. Carved wooden lintels above the doorway depict the king seated in triumph, surrounded by captives and tribute. The construction is ambitious. The pyramid's base covers nearly 2 acres. The core is rubble and earth, held in place by outer walls of limestone blocks. A steep stairway climbs the western face, 170 steps rising at an angle that makes modern visitors grateful for the rope handrails. At the top sits the temple itself, 3 rooms with corbelled vaults, a roof comb that once rose even higher, decorated with stucco sculptures of gods and kings. But here's what puzzles archaeologists. How did they build it? The Maya had no metal tools, no wheels, no draft animals. Every limestone block was quarried using stone hammers, shaped with stone chisels, and hauled into position using human labor and wooden rollers. The rubble core required thousands of tons of material. The precision stonework on the exterior demanded skilled masons, and all of it had to be lifted, block by block, as the pyramid grew taller. Estimates suggest Temple 4 took years to complete, requiring hundreds of workers at any given time. That's hundreds of people who weren't farming, weren't hunting, weren't producing trade goods. They had to be fed, housed, and organized. The logistics alone represent a massive investment. Why? What makes a pyramid worth that much effort? Part of the answer is political. Maya rulers weren't just kings. They were intermediaries between the human world and the divine. Building a temple demonstrated their connection to the gods, their ability to command resources, and their kingdom's strength. Temple 4 was meant to impress, to intimidate, and to endure. It worked. 1,300 years later, it's still standing. But there's a practical aspect too. Maya cities were densely populated. The jungle around them was cleared for agriculture, creating open plazas and sight lines between structures. The temples served as markers, visible for miles. They oriented people spatially, helped them navigate the urban landscape. Temple 4, being the tallest, would have been visible from anywhere in Tikal and from neighboring cities. It was a landmark, a beacon, a statement that couldn't be ignored. The temple's astronomical alignments add another layer of complexity. The doorway faces west, toward the setting sun during the equinoxes. Inside, the rooms are arranged to capture specific angles of light at certain times of year. The Maya were sophisticated astronomers. They tracked Venus with remarkable accuracy, predicted eclipses, and developed a calendar more precise than the one Europe used at the same time. Their temples weren't just religious structures. They were observatories, instruments for measuring time and predicting celestial events. The wooden lintels above Temple 4's doorway are among the finest Maya carvings that survive. They show Yikin-Chan dressed in elaborate costume, holding ceremonial weapons, his feet resting on bound captives. Hieroglyphic texts describe his victories, name his defeated enemies, and record the dates using the Maya long count calendar. These lintels were carved from sapodilla wood, incredibly hard and resistant to decay. Even so, after 1,300 years in the jungle, they're fragile. Most have been removed to museums for preservation. What the carvings tell us is that Tikal was a warrior state. The city fought frequent wars with rivals, Calakmul, Karakol, and others. These weren't territorial conquests in the European sense. Maya warfare was about capturing enemy kings and nobles, extracting tribute, and demonstrating dominance. A successful military campaign would be commemorated with new construction, a temple, a palace, a carved monument. Temple 4 represents one of Tikal's greatest victories, though the exact details have been lost. The city's decline began in the late 8th century, not long after Temple 4 was completed. By 900 AD, Tikal was abandoned. The population dispersed into smaller settlements or migrated entirely. This wasn't unique to Tikal. Maya cities across the region collapsed during this period, an event archaeologists call the classic Maya collapse. The causes are still debated. Drought seems to have played a role. Soil depletion from intensive agriculture, warfare that became too costly to sustain, political fragmentation as centralized kingdoms broke apart. But it's more complicated than a single cause. Different cities collapsed at different times, for different reasons. Some were conquered, others were abandoned gradually as people drifted away. Tikal's end appears to have been relatively peaceful. There's no evidence of destruction, no burned palaces, no mass graves. People simply stopped building, stopped maintaining the structures, and eventually left. The jungle reclaimed the plazas. Trees grew through temple floors. Roots buckled limestone walls. Within a few generations, Tikal was hidden beneath vegetation, forgotten, except in local oral traditions. Spanish conquistadors never found Tikal. They heard rumors of ruined cities in the jungle, but the terrain was too difficult, the jungle too dense. It wasn't until 1848 that outsiders reached the site, and even then, it took decades before serious archaeology began. Early excavations focused on the temples and palaces, the monumental architecture that could be cleared and photographed. But most of Tikal remains unexcavated. The residential areas, the markets, the workshops where daily life unfolded, those are still buried beneath centuries of soil and vegetation. Recent LiDAR surveys have revolutionized our understanding of the site. By using aircraft-mounted lasers to penetrate the jungle canopy, archaeologists can map structures without clearing a single tree. The results are astonishing. Tikal is far larger than anyone realized. What was thought to be empty jungle is actually filled with low stone platforms, causeways, agricultural terraces, and defensive earthworks. The population estimates have been revised upward, perhaps 200,000 people, not 100,000. The city wasn't a collection of temples in a forest. It was a sprawling urban complex that reshaped the landscape for miles. But LiDAR also reveals something troubling. The Maya deforested the region extensively. Satellite imagery shows soil erosion patterns dating back centuries. Chemical analysis of lake sediments confirms widespread environmental degradation. Tikal grew too large for its resource base. The population exceeded what the land could sustain, and when drought struck, the system collapsed. It's a cautionary tale, one that feels uncomfortably relevant today. The question archaeologists keep returning to is, did they know? Were there Maya leaders who recognized the danger, who understood that their civilization was consuming itself? There's some evidence that they did. Construction slowed in the decades before collapse. Some cities invested in water management systems, building reservoirs to cope with drought. But it wasn't enough. Or maybe the political will to make drastic changes simply didn't exist. It's easier to keep building temples, to maintain the rituals, to believe the gods will provide, right up until the moment everything falls apart. Temple 4 still stands, moss-covered and magnificent. Tourists climb the wooden stairs, photograph the view, and marvel at what ancient people achieved. But the real story isn't the triumph of construction. It's the vulnerability beneath. Tikal was powerful, wealthy, and sophisticated. It was also fragile. The temples endure, but the civilization that built them vanished. And we still don't fully understand why. Just above the city of Cusco, Peru, 3 massive stone walls zigzag across a hillside. These are the walls of Sacsayhuaman, and they represent stone masonry so precise that you can't slide a knife blade between the blocks. Some of the stones weigh over 200 tons. They're fitted together in 3-dimensional jigsaw puzzles, each surface curved and angled to lock with its neighbors. And somehow, the Inca did this without iron tools, without the wheel, and without written plans. The name Sacsayhuaman means satisfied falcon in Quechua, though Spanish chroniclers mangled the pronunciation into something that sounds unfortunate in English. The site was sacred to the Inca, both a fortress and a ceremonial center. They held festivals here, conducted rituals, and when the Spanish arrived in 1533, this is where the final desperate resistance took place. The construction date is uncertain. Traditional Inca history, recorded by Spanish chroniclers, credits the Emperor Pachacuti, who ruled in the mid-1400s. But some researchers think parts of the complex are older, possibly built by pre-Inca cultures and later incorporated into the Inca Empire. The problem is that stonemasonry is difficult to date. Without organic material like wood or bone, there's nothing to carbon date. You're left with stylistic analysis and educated guesses. What's undeniable is the technical achievement. The largest stones at Sacsayhuaman are among the biggest moved by any ancient civilization. Engineers have studied the site, trying to understand the methods. The prevailing theory involves wooden levers, rope, and hundreds of workers. The Inca would quarry a stone, shape it roughly, and drag it to the construction site using log rollers. Once there, they'd position it, mark where it touched neighboring stones, remove it, and carve away high spots until the fit was perfect. Then they'd haul it back into place and repeat the process with the next stone. It's tedious, time-consuming work. A single stone might take weeks or months to fit properly. But the Inca had something many ancient civilizations lacked: a highly organized labor system called mit'a. Every citizen owed the state a certain amount of labor each year. That labor built roads, terraced mountainsides, and erected structures like Sacsayhuaman. It wasn't slavery. It was taxation paid in work rather than money, and it allowed the Inca to mobilize thousands of workers for state projects. But even with unlimited labor, moving 200-ton stones presents engineering challenges. Modern cranes can handle it easily, but replicating the feat with Bronze Age technology is another matter. Experiments using period-appropriate tools and methods have managed to move stones weighing a few tons. Scaling up to 200 tons requires either techniques we haven't thought of or a level of coordination that's difficult to imagine. Some researchers have proposed alternative theories. Maybe the Inca used water to lubricate the path, reducing friction. Maybe they built temporary earthen ramps that were later removed. Maybe they used a combination of methods, depending on the specific stone and terrain. The Inca left no written records explaining their techniques, and the Spanish chroniclers didn't think to ask. By the time Europeans became curious about engineering methods, the knowledge had vanished. The Spanish conquest destroyed much of Sacsayhuaman. The conquistadors recognized it as a defensive position and systematically dismantled the upper structures. They used the stones to build colonial Cusco. Many churches and mansions in the city contain blocks quarried from the fortress. What remains today is roughly a third of the original complex, and even in ruins, it's staggering. The three main walls rise in tiers, each about 15 feet tall, creating a zigzag pattern that extends nearly 1,000 feet. The design is both aesthetic and defensive. The angles create blind spots where attackers can be ambushed, and the height forces anyone approaching to expose themselves to defenders on multiple levels. It's sophisticated military architecture comparable to anything built in medieval Europe. But Sacsayhuaman wasn't just a fortress. The complex includes a circular structure called Muyuk Marka, likely a tower or temple. There are underground chambers, water channels, and carved rock outcrops that seem to have ritual significance. The Inca integrated natural stone formations into their architecture. Boulders would be carved and shaped to fit the overall design, blurring the line between natural and constructed. This is visible throughout the site. You'll see massive stone walls ending at a carved boulder that's been incorporated as if it were just another block. When the Spanish arrived, Sacsayhuaman became a battleground. Manco Inca, leading a rebellion against the conquistadors in 1536, used the fortress as his base. For months, he besieged Cusco, nearly driving the Spanish out. But the Europeans had cavalry and firearms. They eventually stormed Sacsayhuaman, killed the defenders, and secured their hold on Peru. The battle was brutal. Spanish chroniclers describe streets running with blood, piles of indigenous bodies, and the fortress walls stained red. After the conquest, the Spanish systematically looted the site. Gold and silver decorations were melted down. Anything portable was taken. Then they began dismantling the walls themselves, using the stones for new construction. It's estimated that nearly 2/3 of Sacsayhuaman was removed over the following centuries. What remains is impressive enough to make you wonder what was lost. The Inca themselves remain something of a mystery. Their empire lasted less than a century, from roughly 1438 to 1533. But in that time, they built thousands of miles of roads, created agricultural terraces that still function today, and constructed monumental architecture that defies easy explanation. They had no writing system, relying instead on quipu, knotted strings used to record numbers and possibly narrative information. Without written records, most of what we know comes from Spanish chroniclers, who often misunderstood or deliberately distorted what they observed. Modern archaeology is trying to recover the Inca perspective. Researchers work with Quechua-speaking communities, many of whom maintain traditions that stretch back to pre-conquest times. There's growing recognition that the Inca worldview was fundamentally different from European concepts. They didn't see themselves as conquering nature. They were part of it. Mountains were sacred beings. Rivers had spirits. Stone wasn't just material. It was alive in a way that made shaping it a spiritual act as much as a practical one. That perspective might explain the extraordinary care taken with structures like Sacsayhuaman. These weren't just buildings. They were statements about the relationship between humans, earth, and the divine. Every stone was selected, shaped, and positioned with intention. The precision wasn't showing off, it was reverence. Recent studies using ground-penetrating radar have revealed that Sacsayhuaman extends underground more than anyone realized. There are chambers, tunnels, and structures buried beneath the visible ruins. Some may have been intentionally covered after the Spanish conquest, hidden to protect them from looters. Others might have collapsed or been filled in over the centuries. Archaeologists are only beginning to explore these subterranean spaces, and what they're finding suggests Sacsayhuaman was far more complex than the fortress walls suggest. There's also renewed interest in Inca astronomy. The site's alignment isn't random. Lines of sight from specific points connect to astronomical events, solstices, equinoxes, the rising of certain stars. The Inca used these alignments to regulate their calendar, time agricultural activities, and conduct religious ceremonies. Sacsayhuaman might have functioned as an observatory, a place where priest astronomers tracked celestial movements and made predictions. But for all the research, fundamental questions remain. How did they move the largest stones? What tools did they use for the finest carving? How was the labor organized on a day-to-day basis? And perhaps most importantly, what did Sacsayhuaman mean to the people who built it? Was it primarily defensive, religious, or political? Was it all three? The stones themselves offer no answers. They sit, massive and silent, fitted together with a precision that modern masons struggle to replicate. Tourists run their hands along the seams, feeling for gaps that don't exist. Engineers take measurements, trying to reverse engineer techniques, and the walls endure, having survived earthquakes that leveled colonial buildings in Cusco, testimony to knowledge we've lost and skills we're still trying to understand. In the western desert of Egypt, nearly 350 miles from the Nile, an oasis breaks the monotony of sand and rock. This is Siwa, and in ancient times, it was home to one of the most famous oracles in the Mediterranean world, the Temple of Ammon. Alexander the Great traveled here in 331 BC to consult the oracle. Persian kings sent emissaries. Greek pilgrims made the dangerous desert crossing seeking prophecies. And today, archaeologists are still trying to understand how a remote outpost became one of the ancient world's most influential religious sites. The temple sits on a hill called Agurmi, overlooking the oasis. What remains today are ruins, crumbling mud brick walls, a few stone blocks, fragments of columns. Most of the structure has dissolved back into the landscape. Mud brick doesn't survive well in any climate, and even in the desert, salt erosion and occasional rains take their toll. But 2,000 years ago, this was a complex of buildings, courtyards, and processional ways, all dedicated to the god Ammon, or Amun as the Egyptians called him. The oracle's fame spread because of its accuracy, or at least its reputation for accuracy. Ancient sources describe pilgrims arriving with questions about war, marriage, business ventures, and political alliances. The priests would consult the god, interpret signs, and deliver prophecies that were often vague enough to be interpreted multiple ways. It was a system that couldn't fail. If the prophecy came true, the oracle's reputation grew. If it didn't, well, the pilgrim must have misunderstood the god's message. But Siwa's real power came from its isolation. Getting there was difficult and dangerous. The desert crossing required guides who knew the route, knowledge of water sources, and the ability to navigate by stars and landmarks. Not just anyone could make the journey. That exclusivity made the oracle's pronouncements more valuable. If you went through all that effort to reach Siwa, you were committed to believing whatever the priests told you. Alexander's visit is the most famous. He arrived in 331 BC, fresh from conquering Egypt. According to ancient historians, he consulted the oracle privately, asking whether he was truly the son of Zeus Ammon, a claim that would legitimize his rule over Egypt and distinguish him from mere mortal kings. The oracle reportedly confirmed his divine parentage. Whether Alexander believed it or simply found it politically useful, we'll never know. But he left Siwa with renewed confidence and went on to conquer most of the known world. What the Greeks called Zeus Ammon was originally the Egyptian god Amun, who by the New Kingdom had become associated with the sun god Ra. Amun-Ra was the king of gods, the hidden one, the creator. His main cult center was at Karnak in Thebes, but worship spread throughout Egypt and into Nubia. How and why a temple was established at Siwa, so far from traditional Egyptian centers, remains unclear. Some researchers suggest Siwa was already a sacred site long before the Egyptians arrived. The oasis has springs that never run dry, even in the worst droughts. In a desert environment, reliable water is miraculous. Local populations might have worshipped here for centuries, and the Egyptians simply incorporated those existing beliefs into their own religious framework, identifying the local deity with Amun. The archaeological evidence is frustratingly sparse. Excavations at the temple site have uncovered foundation walls, pottery fragments, and a few inscriptions. One fragment mentions the 26th dynasty pharaoh Amasis, who ruled in the 6th century BC. That gives us a rough date for major construction, but it doesn't tell us when worship at Siwa began or how the site gained its reputation. What's clear is that by the Persian period, roughly 525 BC onward, Siwa was internationally famous. The Greek historian Herodotus mentions it. Persian sources describe an army sent to destroy the oracle, a force that disappeared into the desert and was never seen again. Whether that story is true or propaganda designed to enhance Siwa's mystique, it reinforced the idea that the temple was protected by divine forces. The oracle's method of delivering prophecies is partially documented. Ancient writers describe a golden boat carried by priests during festivals. The boat would move in response to questions, forward for yes, backward for no, or something more complex involving the direction and intensity of movement. The priests interpreted these movements as the god's will. Skeptics suggested the priests themselves controlled the boat's motion, using subtle shifts in weight or pre-arranged signals. Believers insisted the god genuinely moved the vessel. It's impossible to know which interpretation is correct. What matters is that people believed. Pilgrims traveled from across the Mediterranean, endured the desert crossing, and accepted the oracle's pronouncements as divine truth. That belief shaped political decisions, military campaigns, and personal lives. The Temple of Amun at Siwa wielded influence far beyond what its physical size or location would suggest. The decline of the oracle is tied to broader historical shifts. As Christianity spread through the Roman Empire, pagan temples lost support. By the 4th century AD, the oracle at Siwa was no longer functioning. The priests either converted, died out, or were driven away. The temple fell into disrepair. Without maintenance, mud brick structures erode quickly, sand accumulated, walls collapsed. Within a few centuries, the once great oracle was little more than a pile of clay, returning to dust. Modern Siwa is a small town, mostly Berber in culture, speaking a dialect distinct from Egyptian Arabic. The people here have their own traditions, some of which predate Islam, Christianity, and even ancient Egyptian influence. There are stories about the old temple, about Alexander's visit, about hidden chambers beneath the ruins, but separating fact from legend is nearly impossible. The town's oral history has been influenced by centuries of visitors, each adding their own interpretations and embellishments. Recent archaeological work has focused on preserving what remains. Salt rising from underground water sources continues to damage the structures. Climate change has altered rainfall patterns, causing unexpected erosion. Conservators are experimenting with methods to stabilize the mud brick, but it's a losing battle. Within another century, there may be nothing left of the Temple of Amun except photographs and memories. The bigger mystery is what we've lost. The temple at Siwa was part of a network of oracles and religious sites spanning the ancient Mediterranean. These places were centers of learning, astronomy, medicine, and philosophy as much as religion. The priests were educated, multilingual, and connected to intellectual currents flowing between Egypt, Greece, Persia, and beyond. When these temples closed, That knowledge largely disappeared. We have fragments, texts copied and recopied by medieval monks, inscriptions carved in stone, occasional references in surviving literature. But the day-to-day workings of places like Siwa, the training of the priests, the methods they used to interpret signs and deliver prophecies, those details are gone. We know the oracle existed. We know it was influential. But how it actually functioned remains speculative. Standing at Siwa today, looking out over the palm groves and salt lakes, you can understand why ancient people thought this place was sacred. It's an island of life in an ocean of lifeless sand. The springs that feed the oasis come from aquifers deep underground, water that fell as rain thousands of years ago and has been slowly percolating through limestone ever since. To people who didn't understand hydrology, it must have seemed like a gift from the gods, and maybe, in a sense, it was. The Temple of Ammon is a reminder that influence doesn't always come from size or proximity to power. Sometimes it comes from isolation, from the difficulty of access, from the mystique of distance. Siwa was never a great city. It was never the capital of anything. But for a few centuries, it was the place where kings came to seek answers. And that was enough to secure its place in history, even as the physical structures crumble back into the desert that surrounds them. 7 sites, 7 cultures separated by oceans and centuries. Yet they share something fundamental. Each represents human beings pushing against the limits of what should be possible. The engineers who lifted 200-ton stones at Sacsayhuaman, the architects who designed earthquake-resistant buildings at Caral 4,000 years before modern seismology, the masons who fitted granite blocks so precisely at Great Zimbabwe that mortar became unnecessary, the planners who organized the construction of Tikal's pyramids without metal tools or written instructions. These achievements challenge our assumptions about progress. We tend to think of history as a steady upward climb, each generation building on the last, technology advancing in a straight line from primitive to sophisticated. But that's not how it worked. Knowledge was gained and lost. Civilizations rose, flourished, and vanished, taking their expertise with them. The people who built Montezuma Castle knew things about desert architecture that we're only now rediscovering. The priests at Siwa understood something about belief and influence that can't be reduced to simple manipulation. What we're left with are questions, not the comfortable kind that have answers in the back of the book, but the kind that keep archaeologists awake at night. How did they do it? Why did they stop? What did they know that we've forgotten? And perhaps most unsettling, what are we building today that future generations will look at with the same confusion, the same sense that something essential has been lost? These ruins aren't just tourist attractions or archaeological curiosities. They're evidence of human potential that existed long before we thought it possible. They're proof that our ancestors were clever, determined, and capable of achievements we still struggle to explain. And they're warnings. Every one of these sites was eventually abandoned. The people who built them couldn't sustain what they'd created. The walls remained, but the knowledge, the social structures, the beliefs that made construction possible, those disappeared. Maybe that's the real mystery. Not how they built these incredible structures, but why they couldn't keep going. What breaks in a civilization when it reaches its limits? Is it resources, climate, politics, or something more subtle, a loss of purpose, a failure of imagination, an exhaustion that seeps through the culture until no one remembers why the old ways mattered. We may never have complete answers. The stones can only tell us so much, but that's not a reason to stop looking. Every excavation reveals new details. Every technological advancement, LIDAR, ground-penetrating radar, DNA analysis, opens doors that were closed to earlier researchers. We're learning more about these sites now than at any point in history. And with each discovery, the picture grows more complex, more fascinating, and somehow more mysterious. Because the more we learn, the more we realize how little we actually know. And that might be the most important lesson these ruins have to teach us. Italy before Rome mattered, before the Caesars, before the Republic, even before the legends of Romulus and Remus. This was Etruscan country, a civilization that flourished in the region we now call Tuscany, starting around 900 BCE and lasting until the Romans absorbed them, erased their language, and took credit for half their innovations. The Etruscans left behind cities that crumbled, temples that dissolved back into the earth. But their tombs, those survived, hundreds of them, carved into the soft, volcanic rock called tufa, creating underground cities for the dead that rival anything the living ever built. Visit Cerveteri or Tarquinia today, and you'll walk through necropolises that stretch for miles, rows of burial mounds rising from the landscape like gentle hills. But those mounds are deceptive. Beneath each one is a tomb, sometimes a single chamber, sometimes an entire house, complete with rooms, hallways, and furniture, all carved from solid rock. Step inside one of these tombs, and the first thing that hits you is the detail. Ceiling beams carved in stone, imitating wooden construction. Pillars that serve no structural purpose, but are there because that's what a proper house should have. Even the furniture is carved in place. Stone beds, stone chairs, stone shelves where the dead person's possessions would have been displayed. Whoever designed these spaces wasn't just creating a burial vault. They were recreating home. The walls tell stories. Frescoes painted in red, black, and ochre show scenes of banquets, dancers, musicians, athletes competing in games, hunters pursuing deer through forests, ships sailing across painted waves. These aren't somber memorial images. They're celebrations. Life continuing beyond death, rendered in pigment that somehow survived 25 centuries underground. One tomb shows a married couple reclining on a stone couch, their painted faces turned toward each other in conversation. Another depicts servants bringing food and wine as if preparing for an eternal feast. The Etruscans clearly believed death wasn't an ending. It was a transition to another existence, one that looked a lot like the best moments of the life they'd just left. But here's what makes these tombs archaeologically fascinating. They're time capsules. The Etruscans buried their dead with everything they might need: pottery, bronze mirrors, jewelry, weapons, even cosmetics. And because the tombs were sealed and stayed sealed for thousands of years, those objects survived intact. We've learned more about Etruscan daily life from their tombs than from any of their settlements. Take the pottery, ware they call it, black, burnished ceramic that the Etruscans produced in enormous quantities. We've found examples in tombs across the region, showing trade networks that stretched from central Italy to the Greek islands and beyond. Or the bronze work, intricate figurines, decorated mirrors, elaborate candelabra that demonstrate metalworking skills as advanced as anything in the Mediterranean at that time. And then there are the sarcophagi, stone coffins with sculpted lids showing the deceased reclining at a banquet, often with a serene smile. Some are individual, others show couples lying side by side, husband and wife together in death as they were in life. There's a warmth to these sculptures, a humanity that's rare in ancient funerary art. These aren't distant, idealized figures. They're people. You can almost imagine the conversations they had, the meals they shared, the lives they lived before someone carved their likenesses into limestone. But for all we've learned from Etruscan tombs, we're still guessing about the big questions. What did they actually believe about the afterlife? The tomb decorations suggest continuity, that life goes on much as before, just in a different realm. But was that literal belief or comforting metaphor? And what about the elaborate rituals they performed? We know they had priests who read omens, interpreted lightning, communicated with the dead. But the details of those practices died with the language. Because that's the tragedy of the Etruscans. We can read their inscriptions, sort of. We know enough Etruscan to recognize names, a few basic words, but we can't read their literature, assuming they had any. Can't access their philosophy, or their poetry, or their explanations for why they built the way they did. The Romans saw to that, absorbed the culture, kept the engineering and the religious practices they found useful, and let the rest fade away. What remains are the tombs, silent houses carved into hillsides, filled with the possessions of people whose names we sometimes know, but whose thoughts are lost. They built for eternity and achieved it, just not in the way they probably intended. Meanwhile, on the coast of modern Turkey, another ancient people built a legendary citadel that would shape warfare and mythology for 3,000 years. The coast of northwestern Anatolia, where the Dardanelles meet the Aegean Sea. Strategic ground. Any power that controlled this stretch of shoreline controlled trade between the Mediterranean and the Black Sea. And someone realized that early, very early. We know the place as Troy. Homer made it immortal with his epic about bronze-armored heroes and a war fought over a stolen queen. For centuries, scholars assumed it was all fiction. Beautiful poetry, but nothing more. Then, Heinrich Schliemann started digging in 1870, and the fiction became fact. There was a Troy. Actually, there were 9 of them, stacked one on top of the other like archaeological layer cake. But forget the Troy of Achilles and Hector for a moment. We're interested in the earliest settlement. Troy I, as archaeologists call it. This citadel dates back to around 3000 BCE, making it older than most of what we think of as ancient history. Older than Mycenaean Greece. Older than the Hittite Empire. Contemporary with the first pharaohs of Egypt. What Schliemann found at the lowest levels was a fortified settlement. Stone walls, thick and solid, encircling the top of a hill. The location wasn't accidental. From this high ground, you could see for miles, watch ships entering the strait, monitor the roads approaching from the interior. It was a watchtower, a fortress, and a trading post all in one. The earliest walls weren't elaborate. Rough-cut limestone blocks stacked without mortar, forming a defensive perimeter maybe 300 meters across. Not huge, but substantial. And clearly built with defense in mind, because these weren't people worried about wild animals. They were worried about other people. Inside the walls, excavators found remains of rectangular houses, timber frames with stone foundations packed close together. Narrow streets barely wide enough for for two people to pass. This was urban planning at its most primitive. Get everyone inside the walls, maximize the protected space, and hope the fortifications hold if trouble comes. And trouble must have come, because Troy, I didn't last. The settlement burned. Whether it was war, accident, or something else, we can't say for certain. But the destruction layer is clear. Ash, charred wood, collapsed walls. The people who survived rebuilt on top of the ruins, creating Troy 2. And when that burned, they built Troy 3. The pattern continued for 3,000 years. But here's what's remarkable about the earliest Troy. The people who built it weren't working from some established template. There was no nearby civilization they could copy. No instruction manual for building fortified settlements. They figured it out themselves, looked at their landscape, assessed the threats, and engineered a solution. Consider the walls. The builders chose limestone, a material abundant in the area but hard to work without metal tools. Each block had to be shaped, moved, and positioned. The wall had to be thick enough to resist attack, but not so massive that it took decades to complete. And it had to follow the natural contours of the hill, adapting to the terrain rather than fighting it. Then there's the question of social organization. You don't build fortifications unless there's something worth protecting. Stored grain, maybe. Trade goods. Wealth accumulated through commerce with passing ships. That means Troy, I wasn't just a farming village. It was a commercial hub, a place where goods changed hands and wealth concentrated enough to make defense necessary. Who exactly were these people? We don't know. They left no writing, no grand tombs. The artifacts from Troy, one are modest. Basic pottery, simple tools, nothing that screams power or sophistication. But they controlled a critical piece of geography, and they knew it, built accordingly. Later legends claim Troy was founded by Dardanus, son of Zeus, or by Ilus, grandson of the same. The Greeks spun elaborate genealogies connecting Trojan kings to gods and heroes. But those are Bronze Age stories, created long after Troy one had turned to dust. The real founders remain anonymous. Just practical people solving a practical problem. How to survive in a world where location is destiny. The citadel they built wasn't perfect. It burned and was rebuilt repeatedly. Each new generation added to it, strengthened it, expanded it. By the time we get to Troy 6 and 7, the levels that might correspond to Homer's war, the settlement had grown into a significant city with massive walls and sophisticated architecture. But it all started with that first stone fortification on a windy hill overlooking the strait. Stand on that hill today, and you can still see where the earliest walls ran. Not much left, just foundation stones and archaeological markers, but enough to trace the outline, enough to imagine what it took to build something permanent in a world where nothing lasted. Southern India in the state of Kerala. The Western Ghats mountain range runs like a spine down the coast, creating a landscape of hills, forests, and valleys that catch the monsoon rains. In this green country, tucked into clearings and scattered across hillsides, you'll find hundreds of massive stone structures that have no business being there. Dolmens, that's the technical term. Megalithic tombs made from enormous slabs of rock, vertical stones supporting a capstone that can weigh several tons. They look simple, almost crude. 3 or 4 upright stones with a flat rock balanced on top, creating a chamber underneath. But simple doesn't mean easy. The Marayor region has the highest concentration. More than 200 documented dolmens, probably more that haven't been officially counted yet. Some stand alone in fields, others cluster in groups, like small stone villages. And they're old, dating anywhere from 1500 BCE to 200 BCE, depending on which archaeologist you ask and which site you're examining. Walk up to one of these dolmens and the first question that hits you is transportation. These aren't pebbles. The capstones are massive slabs of granite, or laterite, weighing anywhere from 2 to 15 tons. And they're not sitting on flat ground. Many dolmens occupy hillsides, ridges, places where you'd have to drag that stone uphill through forest, without wheels, without pulleys, using nothing but ropes, wooden rollers, and human muscle. Why go to that effort? The obvious answer is burial. Excavations have found human remains inside many of the dolmens, along with pottery, iron tools, and occasionally beads or other grave goods. These were definitely tombs, but the amount of labor involved suggests they weren't for ordinary people. Moving a 10-ton rock takes a village, literally. You need dozens of people working together, which means community resources being directed toward honoring specific individuals. So who got dolmen burials? Chieftains, probably. Warriors, maybe religious leaders. People important enough that their death warranted a permanent stone monument. The dolmens make a statement. This person mattered, and we want everyone who passes this way to know it. But there's another layer to this. The dolmens aren't randomly distributed. They tend to cluster near trade routes, near sources of water, near areas where you'd expect settlements. Some researchers think they served dual purposes. Yes, they're tombs, but they're also territorial markers, a way for one group to claim land and announce their presence to anyone passing through. See that massive stone structure? We put that there. This is our territory. The construction technique varies slightly from site to site, which suggests different groups building over long periods using local traditions. Some dolmens have a fourth stone, closing off the entrance. Others leave the chamber open. A few have smaller stones stacked around the base, creating a kind of platform or foundation. And then there are the porthole dolmens, structures with a circular opening carved into one of the upright stones, just big enough for a person to crawl through. Those porthole openings are fascinating because they show up in megalithic tombs all over the world. Europe has them, the Middle East has them, and here they are in southern India. Did the idea spread through trade networks, or did different cultures independently arrive at the same solution? We don't know, but the similarity is striking. What we do know is that building dolmens required knowledge. You can't just stack heavy rocks and hope they stay put. The capstone has to be balanced correctly, or it'll shift and collapse. The upright stones need stable footings, or they'll sink into the soil. Some dolmens have remained standing for more than 3,000 years, which means whoever built them understood weight distribution, leverage, and soil stability. And they kept building them for over 1,000 years. That's cultural continuity. Generation after generation, maintaining the same tradition. Teaching the next group how it's done, why it matters. Even as technology advanced, iron tools appeared, pottery styles changed, trade networks expanded. The dolmens remained, a constant in a changing world. Then, around 200 BCE, the tradition stopped. Later cultures in the region buried their dead differently, built different monuments. The dolmens became relics, gradually swallowed by forest growth and forgotten by everyone except local communities who spun legends around them. Stories about giants, about demons, about ancient kings who commanded the stones into position. But the stones don't need legends. They're impressive enough on their own. Stand next to one, feel the rough texture of weathered granite, see the precision of the placement, and you understand that these were built by people who knew exactly what they were doing. People with skills and determination and a vision of permanence. Crete, the largest of the Greek islands, sitting at the crossroads of 3 continents. Bronze Age civilizations rose and fell here, but the most famous is Minoan, named after the legendary King Minos, who supposedly kept a minotaur in a labyrinth beneath his palace. Arthur Evans excavated Knossos in the early 1900s and found that palace, or at least what remained of it. Elaborate frescoes, advanced plumbing, a complex of rooms so maze-like that the labyrinth myth suddenly made sense. But Evans found something else. Beneath the palace he excavated, beneath the Bronze Age construction that everyone associates with Minoan civilization, there were older layers, much older. Foundations and walls and pottery that dated back to the Neolithic period, around 7000 BCE. That's 9,000 years ago. Long before writing, before metalworking, before anyone was supposed to be building anything this substantial. The earliest settlement at Knossos wasn't a palace, it was a village. Mud brick houses, simple stone foundations, evidence of farming and animal husbandry. But it was organized. Streets ran in recognizable patterns, houses clustered in neighborhoods. And the settlement was big, covering several acres by 3000 BCE, supporting maybe 1,000 people. For the Neolithic period, that's practically a city. What makes pre-Minoan Knossos significant isn't size, though. It's continuity. People lived on this site for thousands of years. Generation after generation, they built on top of older structures, using the same location, the same basic orientation. When a house collapsed or burned, they cleared the debris and built a new one in the same spot. That kind of persistence suggests the location mattered. Maybe it was the water supply. There's a stream nearby. Maybe it was the soil, fertile enough to support continuous agriculture. Or maybe it was something less tangible. A sacred site, a place that held meaning beyond practical considerations. By the late Neolithic period, around 3500 BCE, the settlement was showing signs of social complexity. Larger buildings start appearing in the archaeological record. Structures that aren't quite houses, not quite temples, but something in between. Communal spaces, possibly. Places where people gathered for ceremonies or to make collective decisions. The pottery from this period becomes more sophisticated, better formed, decorated with increasingly elaborate patterns. That suggests craft specialization, people whose job was making pottery, not farming. And then around 2000 BCE, someone decided to build a palace. Not a chief's house, not a temple. A genuine palace with storage rooms, workshops, administrative quarters, and ceremonial spaces. That's the structure Evans excavated, the one with the famous frescoes and the throne room. But it didn't appear out of nowhere. It was built on top of a settlement that had been there for 5,000 years. All those generations of accumulated knowledge, all that social complexity finally crystallizing into monumental architecture. The pre-Minoan people couldn't have predicted that, couldn't have known that their small farming village would eventually become the center of a Bronze Age civilization. But they laid the groundwork, established the patterns, created a community stable enough to persist through climate changes, through cultural shifts, through whatever challenges Neolithic life threw at them. What were they like, those early residents? We have fragments. The pottery tells us they had artistic sensibilities, that they valued decoration and craftsmanship. The animal bones found in excavations show they kept sheep, goats, and cattle, standard Mediterranean livestock. They grew wheat and barley, made bread, produced olive oil. The basics of farming that would sustain the region for millennia. But we don't have their names, don't have their stories. The pre-Minoan people didn't write, didn't leave inscriptions. When writing finally appeared at Knossos, it was Linear A, the script of the Bronze Age Minoans, and we still can't fully decipher it. Anything earlier is completely lost. What we do have is the site itself, the layers of occupation, the gradual evolution from simple village to complex society. You can see it in the stratigraphy, each level representing centuries of human activity, compressed into bands of soil and debris. At the bottom, crude pottery and basic tools. Higher up, refined ceramics and evidence of trade with other regions. And at the top, the palace, the culmination of everything that came before. Archaeologists debate what triggered the transition from village to palace. Some say it was trade. Knossos sits in a good location for maritime commerce, and controlling trade routes creates wealth and power. Others point to agriculture. Surplus grain needs storage. Storage needs organization. Organization requires hierarchy. Maybe it was both. Maybe it was something else entirely. Eastern Iran, near the Afghan border. The Sistan Basin, a desert plain that's hostile to human life 9 months out of the year. Temperatures that swing from freezing to scorching, winds that strip the soil down to bedrock. And sitting in the middle of this landscape is Shahr-i Sokhta, the burnt city. The name is literal. The site shows evidence of at least 3 major fires that destroyed large portions of the settlement. But fire wasn't what ended it. The city was abandoned around 1800 BCE, left to the desert, buried under sand and wind-blown debris for 4,000 years. Italian archaeologists started excavating in the 1960s and discovered something unexpected. This wasn't just another ancient settlement. It was sophisticated, planned, and far more advanced than anything that was supposed to exist in this region at this time. Shahr-i Sokhta dates back to around 3200 BCE. That makes it contemporary with the earliest civilizations in Mesopotamia and Egypt. But while those cultures are well documented, Shahr-i Sokhta remains relatively unknown, buried in academic journals and specialist publications. It doesn't fit the standard narrative of how civilization developed, so it gets overlooked. The city covered roughly 150 hectares at its peak, roughly 370 acres. That's substantial. Housing maybe 5,000 people, possibly more, and those people weren't scattered randomly across the landscape. They built in districts, residential areas here, workshop zones there, administrative sections in a different quarter, urban planning. Zoning before anyone was supposed to know what zoning was. The platforms are what catch your attention first. Raised foundations built from mud brick, creating elevated surfaces for major structures. Some platforms rise several meters above the surrounding terrain. Why elevate buildings in a desert? Flooding, probably. The Helmand River runs through the region, and when seasonal rains hit, flash floods can turn dry wadis into torrents in minutes. Building on platforms keeps your structures above the water. But there's more to it than flood control. The platforms create a visual hierarchy. Important buildings sit higher, literally looking down on everything else. It's a statement of power, of organization, of a society complex enough to have layers. And the labor involved in building these platforms, mixing mud, forming bricks, stacking them into stable foundations. That's a massive investment. You need coordination, surplus food to support workers, some kind of authority directing where platforms get built and how high. Inside the residential areas, excavators found standardized housing, not identical, but following common patterns. Rectangular rooms arranged around small courtyards, walls made from mud brick, usually plastered. Some houses had multiple stories. You can tell from the thickness of foundation walls and the presence of stairway bases. This was permanent architecture. People building homes meant to last generations. The workshop districts are fascinating. One area specialized in lapidary work, cutting and polishing semi-precious stones like lapis lazuli, turquoise, carnelian. Another focused on metallurgy. Excavators found crucibles, slag, and copper objects showing sophisticated smelting techniques. There's evidence of textile production, ceramic manufacture, and even a district that seems to have focused on producing beads for trade. Trade. That's probably what made Shahr-i Sokhta possible. The city sits on ancient routes connecting Mesopotamia to the Indus Valley, Central Asia to the Persian Gulf. Goods flowing through these trade networks needed places to stop, to change hands, to be processed and repackaged. Shahr-i Sokhta filled that role, and the people who controlled the trade became wealthy enough to build platforms and palaces. But wealth attracts attention. The fires that gave the city its name might have been accidents, or they might have been attacks. We don't know. What we do know is that each time the city burned, it was rebuilt. Same location, same basic layout. The people who lived there were committed to that spot, even when the desert and occasional fires made it a hard place to survive. And then there are the burials, thousands of them. The cemetery at Shahr-i Sokhta is enormous, with graves showing distinct social classes. Elite burials include elaborate grave goods, metal objects, jewelry, imported pottery. Common burials are simpler. But everyone got buried with something. Food offerings at minimum. A recognition that death required ritual, that the deceased needed provisions for whatever came next. One grave contained the world's oldest known artificial eye, worn by a woman around 2800 BCE. Functional and clearly used in life, it should have reshaped views of ancient medicine. Yet Shahr-i Sokhta remains largely ignored. Southwestern Iran, in the province of Khuzestan. The landscape here is flat, agricultural, dotted with oil wells and modern infrastructure. But rising from the fields, looking almost alien against the horizon, is a stepped pyramid of brick. Choqa Zanbil, a ziggurat, one of the few outside Mesopotamia that survived intact enough to show what these structures actually looked like. The name means basket mound. Local residents saw the shape, concentric levels stacked like baskets, and named it accordingly. But the original name was Dur-Untash, the city of Untash, after the Elamite king who ordered its construction around 1250 BCE. That's late Bronze Age, contemporaneous with the Egyptian New Kingdom and the tail end of Mycenaean Greece. The world had cities by then, empires, writing systems, but ziggurats, those were still uncommon outside of Mesopotamia proper. The Elamites built Choqa Zanbil as a religious complex, a dedicated sacred city separate from their capital at Susa. The ziggurat itself was the centerpiece, originally 5 levels tall, rising roughly 50 meters above the plain. Today, only 2.5 levels remain, but that's enough. Enough to show the scale, the ambition, the sheer amount of brick required to build something this massive. And it's all brick, millions of them, each one sun-dried or kiln-fired, each one stamped with Elamite cuneiform, identifying the king who commissioned the work. The bricks were laid in precise patterns, courses alternating between stretchers and headers to create structural stability. No mortar between the bricks in the interior, just clay and bitumen in the outer facing layers. The whole structure held together by weight, friction, and geometric precision. Why build it here? Choqa Zanbil wasn't on a trade route, wasn't strategically positioned for defense. The location seems almost arbitrary until you realize it's exactly halfway between Susa and the Elamite religious center at Anshan. Midpoint, neutral ground. A place where the empire's two most important cities could meet symbolically through shared worship. The ziggurat was dedicated to Inshushinak, the Elamite god who protected Susa, but the complex around it held temples to dozens of other deities, Mesopotamian gods, local spirits, foreign divinities, absorbed through conquest or trade. This wasn't just a temple, it was a pantheon in brick, a statement that Elam could accommodate all beliefs, all gods, under one administrative and religious umbrella. Around the ziggurat, archaeologists found the remains of a planned city that was never fully completed. 3 concentric walls originally encircled the complex. The innermost wall surrounded the ziggurat and major temples. The middle wall enclosed residential areas for priests and temple workers. The outer wall would have protected the entire sacred city, but it was never finished. Something stopped construction, and the city was gradually abandoned. What happened? We don't know for certain. The Elamite kingdom faced pressure from Assyria to the west, from migrations and invasions from the east. Political instability, maybe. Economic decline. Or perhaps the whole project was too ambitious, too expensive to sustain. Building a brand new sacred city from scratch takes resources, labor, materials, food to feed workers. If those resources dried up, construction would halt. But what they did complete is remarkable. The ziggurat alone represents an engineering achievement that rivals anything in Mesopotamia. The structure had to support its own enormous weight without crushing the lower levels, had to resist erosion from rain and wind, had to maintain stability even as the brick aged and the structure settled into the soil. And it worked. 27 centuries later, the core of the ziggurat is still standing. Weathered, yes. Partially collapsed, but recognizable. You can still climb the ancient stairs, feel the worn brick under your feet, and imagine the processions that once ascended to the temple at the summit. Inside the ziggurat, excavators found something unusual: elaborate drainage systems, channels and pipes designed to carry water down from the upper levels, preventing it from pooling and weakening the structure. That's sophisticated hydraulic engineering. Someone calculated water flow, designed channels with proper gradients, and integrated them into the construction. This wasn't trial and error. This was applied knowledge. The temple was once richly decorated with glazed bricks, geometric panels, and inscriptions honoring Inshushinak, reconstructed today from surviving fragments. Yet the surrounding city was never completed or fully inhabited, leaving Choqa Zanbil as a sacred but empty monument to ambition. Meanwhile, across the Sahara in West Africa, a very different city emerged, without grand monuments, but with urban planning that endured for 2,000 years. West Africa, the inland delta of the Niger River, where the river spreads into a vast wetland during a flood season. Rich soil, abundant fish, and sitting on a rise above the floodplain is Jenne-Jeno, Old Jenne, the oldest known city in sub-Saharan Africa. That statement usually surprises people. We're conditioned to think of ancient African civilizations as either Egyptian or peripheral. But Jenne-Jeno predates most of what we call medieval Europe. Occupation started around 250 BCE. By 300 CE, this was a thriving urban center covering more than 33 hectares, supporting thousands of residents. And it did so without written records, without monumental stone architecture, without any of the features we typically associate with ancient cities. The site was discovered in the 1970s by archaeologists Susan and Roderick McIntosh. They were looking for evidence of early urbanism in West Africa, and what they found challenged assumptions about how cities develop. Conventional thinking said cities required certain preconditions. Agriculture, yes, but also writing, centralized government, monumental architecture, social hierarchy enforced through visible displays of power. Jenne-Jeno had none of that, and yet it functioned as a city for over 1,000 years. The settlement grew organically, no grid pattern, no central plaza. Houses clustered together, separated by narrow pathways that curved and twisted according to need rather than planning. Each house was built from cylindrical mud bricks, a distinctive construction technique unique to this region. Walls were thick, designed to insulate against heat. Roofs were flat or slightly domed, made from timber and mud plaster. Simple, functional, and apparently sufficient. What made Jenne-Jeno work was trade. The city sat at the convergence of multiple ecological zones: savanna to the north, forest to the south, the river system connecting both. Goods flowed through here: iron from the north, gold from the south, salt from the Sahara, fish from the delta. The city became a marketplace, a neutral ground where different groups could exchange resources. And the archaeological evidence supports this. Excavations found iron tools and copper ornaments from hundreds of miles away, pottery styles from different regions, suggesting either trade or the presence of immigrant communities. Cowrie shells from the Indian Ocean, meaning trade networks stretched across the Sahara to the Mediterranean and beyond. This was a cosmopolitan place, diverse in a way that contradicts the notion of isolated African societies. But there's something else, something that makes Jenne-Jeno unique among ancient cities. There's no evidence of centralized authority, no palace, no temple complex, no elite burials that indicate a ruling class. The houses are relatively uniform in size and quality. Wealth differences existed. Some houses have more imported goods than others, but nothing suggesting kings or priests controlling the population. How does a city function without central authority? The Macintoshes proposed that Jenne-Jeno operated through a system of corporate governance. Decisions made collectively by family groups or trade guilds rather than imposed from above. It's a model that appears in other parts of the world, but it's rare, and it worked here for a remarkably long time. The economy was diverse, iron smelting was a major industry, excavators found furnaces and slag heaps indicating large-scale production. Pottery manufacture was another specialty. The distinctive terracotta sculptures found at the site, human figures, sometimes elaborate, sometimes abstract, suggest artistic traditions maintained over centuries. And then there was food processing, drying fish, grinding grain, producing oil from local plants, the mundane work that sustains urban populations. Religion is harder to pin down. The terracotta figures might be ritual objects, representations of ancestors or spirits, or they might be purely decorative. Without written records, without monumental temples, we're guessing. What we can say is that religion was decentralized, like everything else in Jenne-Jeno. No grand priesthood, no state-sponsored ceremonies, just household and community-level practices that leave only faint traces in the archaeological record. The city thrived for over 1,000 years, reaching its peak around 800 CE. Then gradually, it declined. Not a sudden collapse. No evidence of conquest or disaster, just a slow migration of population to nearby Jenne, about 2 miles away. By 1400 CE, Jenne-Jeno was abandoned. The new city of Jenne grew on the site we know today, with its famous mud brick mosque and its continuation of the architectural traditions first developed at the older site. The shift may have been caused by changing river channels or political changes linked to the spread of Islam. Rather than adapt, people relocated, and Jenne-Jeno faded back into the earth. From Sardinia to India, from Iran to West Africa, across thousands of miles and thousands of years, people were building, creating permanence in a world defined by change. They carved tombs into rock, stacked stones into monuments, raised platforms above floodplains, and shaped cities from mud and ambition. We've recovered fragments of their work, studied their techniques, tried to decode their intentions, and yet the fundamental question remains unanswered. What drove them? What belief? What fear? What hope compelled generation after generation to invest in structures they knew would outlast them? Maybe it's the same impulse that makes us build today, the need to leave a mark, to say in stone or brick or earth that we existed, that we mattered, that something of us will remain when memory fades and names are forgotten. These ancient builders succeeded beyond anything they could have imagined. Their work survived empires, religions, languages, survived climate change and conquest and millennia of neglect. What they created still stands, still speaks, still raises questions we're only beginning to know how to ask. And in those questions, perhaps, lies the most enduring legacy. Not answers, not certainty, but the reminder that every generation builds on foundations it doesn't fully understand, hoping the next generation will decipher what we couldn't. The stones wait, patient, permanent, ready to reveal their secrets to anyone willing to look closely enough. In the farmland outside Seville, Spain, there's a tunnel that shouldn't exist, not according to what we know about the people who lived there 5,000 years ago. The Dolmen de la Pastora stretches nearly 100 feet underground, a corridor built from stones so large it would take a crane to move them today. And yet somehow, Neolithic farmers managed it, without wheels, without metal tools, without any technology we'd recognize. The locals have known about it for centuries. Shepherds used it for shelter. Farmers stored grain inside. But nobody really questioned it until archaeologists started measuring. That's when things got strange. The tunnel runs in a perfectly straight line. The stones overhead, some weighing several tons, balance on upright slabs with barely a gap between them. No mortar, no cement, just stone on stone, fitted so tightly that after 5 millennia, the structure hasn't collapsed. The engineering precision is extraordinary and unsettling. Walk inside and you'll notice the temperature drops. The air smells like damp earth and limestone. Your footsteps echo off the walls. Overhead, massive capstones block out the sky, each one positioned with an accuracy that modern stonemasons respect. These aren't rough-cut boulders stacked carelessly. They're shaped, angled, deliberate. At the end of the corridor sits a circular chamber. This is where they buried their dead. Archaeologists have found pottery shards, bone fragments, tools made from flint. The objects tell us these were farming people, simple lives, small communities, and yet they built something that required knowledge of geometry, physics, and structural engineering. Here's what bothers researchers. Moving one of these capstones would require at least 50 people, maybe more. Lifting it into position without it cracking or crushing the supporting walls. That takes planning, coordination. Someone had to understand weight distribution, leverage, angles. Someone had to organize the labor, feed the workers, keep the project going for months, maybe years. But we have no evidence of the social structure that would make that possible. No palaces, no administrative buildings, no signs of a ruling class who could command that kind of workforce. Just farmers. And this tunnel, radiocarbon dating places the construction around 3000 BCE. That makes it older than the Egyptian pyramids, older than Stonehenge. It belongs to what archaeologists call the megalithic period, a time when cultures across Europe suddenly started building with massive stones. Nobody knows why. There's no gradual progression, no trial and error we can find in the archaeological record. The megaliths just appear. Some researchers think it was religious, a sacred space for burial rituals. The alignment of the tunnel points roughly east, toward the sunrise during the equinoxes. Maybe that mattered to them. Maybe the act of building it was ceremonial, a way to honor the dead by constructing something permanent, something that would outlast memory. Others aren't convinced. The effort seems disproportionate. Why invest so much labor into a tomb? Why not a temple? Why not fortifications? Why bury people in a structure that took years to build when simpler graves would have worked just as well? There's another problem. The Dolmen de la Pastora isn't unique. Across Spain, across Portugal, up into France and Ireland, there are thousands of these megalithic structures. Dolmens, passage tombs, stone circles, all built around the same time, all using similar techniques. But these cultures had no contact with each other, no trade networks that we know of, no shared language. So how did they all learn to build the same way? Some archaeologists suggest it was convergent evolution, different groups independently discovering the same solutions to the same problems. But the similarities are too specific, the engineering too consistent. It's like watching different inventors create identical machines without ever meeting. Then there's the question nobody likes to ask out loud. What if we're underestimating them? What if these Neolithic communities were more advanced than we give them credit for? Not technologically, perhaps, but intellectually. What if they understood things about construction, about collaboration, about planning, that we've assumed only developed with written language and centralized governments? The Dolmen de la Pastora doesn't answer these questions. It just sits there in the Spanish countryside, outlasting empires, religions, languages. Tourists visit occasionally. Archaeologists take measurements. And the tunnel keeps its secrets. Because here's what we still don't know. We don't know how they moved the stones. We don't know how they lifted them. We don't know who designed it, or how many people it took, or what they believed would happen when they sealed their dead inside. We just know they did it, and that it's still standing. High in the Peruvian Andes, there's a wall that doesn't make sense. Not if you're an engineer. Not if you understand physics. The stones at Ollantaytambo fit together like a three-dimensional puzzle, each block cut at impossible angles, some weighing more than 50 tons. And they're not just stacked, they're interlocked. Edges that curve inward, surfaces that slope backward, joints so tight you can't slide a credit card between them. The Inca built this fortress in the 15th century. That's the official story. But when Spanish conquistadors arrived in 1536, they found something they couldn't explain. Blocks too heavy for their own technology to move. Precision that seemed beyond what bronze tools could achieve. They assumed it was older, much older. Some thought the Inca had simply occupied ruins left by an earlier, more advanced civilization. The Inca said otherwise. They claimed their ancestors shaped the stones using plant extracts that softened rock. The Spanish wrote it down, but didn't believe it. Modern archaeologists don't believe it either. And yet, nobody's produced a better explanation. Stand at the base of the wall and look up. The blocks aren't uniform. Some are rectangular. Others have 6 sides, 8 sides. Irregular polygons that shouldn't fit together, but do. Each stone cut to match its neighbors perfectly, like someone planned the entire wall before touching a single piece. That kind of precision requires measurement, calculation, trial and error. Except there's no evidence of error, no rejected blocks lying around, no practice runs. The quarry where these stones came from is 6 miles away, straight across the Urubamba River, then up a mountain. Geologists have confirmed it. The rose-colored granite matches, but moving a 50-ton block 6 miles over that terrain. That's not a construction project. That's a military campaign. Some of the stones show nubs, small protrusions left on the surface. Archaeologists think these were gripping points used to maneuver the blocks into place. Ropes would have been looped around them, teams of workers pulling in coordinated efforts. But the math doesn't work. Even with hundreds of people, even with wooden rollers and ramps, the friction alone would have made it nearly impossible. You'd need lubrication, constant adjustments, and if one rope snapped, if one person lost their grip, the stone would have crushed everyone nearby. Yet they did it, repeatedly. Here's where things get stranger. The wall isn't just functional, it's artistic. The blocks create patterns. Shadows fall across the surface in ways that change throughout the day. Some researchers think the shape of the stones mimics the mountains in the background, a kind of architectural echo of the landscape. Others see it as purely practical. Irregular shapes distribute weight more evenly, making the wall more earthquake-resistant. Both could be true. The Andes sit on a fault line. Earthquakes hit regularly, some violent enough to level entire cities, but Ollantaytambo's walls barely crack. The stones shift slightly during tremors, then settle back into place. Modern buildings in the area don't fare as well. The Inca didn't leave blueprints, no written plans. Their record-keeping system, called quipu, used knotted strings to store information, census data, tribute records, calendars, but nothing about construction techniques, nothing that explains how they engineered these walls. Spanish chroniclers interviewed Inca builders after the conquest. The answers they got were vague. The stones were fitted by eye. Workers knew where each block belonged, as if the process was intuitive, instinctive. That explanation frustrates modern engineers who need measurements, angles, specifications. You can't build something this precise by feel. Or maybe you can. Maybe we've forgotten how. There's a theory, not popular but persistent, that the Inca used models, scaled-down versions of the walls, built from smaller stones, to test configurations before committing to the real thing. It would explain the perfection. But no one's ever found these models. No miniature practice walls. No prototypes. Then there's the unfinished section. On the hillside above Ollantaytambo, there are stones that never made it to the wall. Some are half-carved, still attached to the bedrock. Others were abandoned mid-transport. You can see the paths they were dragged along, worn into the mountainside. Whatever happened, the work stopped abruptly, and it never resumed. Some historians believe war and the Spanish invasion halted construction. But if the knowledge was common, why was it never used again? Why did it disappear completely? No one builds like this anymore. No one knows how. And Ollantaytambo remains, flawless, silent, and unexplained. The Dead Sea Scrolls made Qumran famous. Ancient texts hidden in caves, preserved for 2,000 years, containing some of the oldest biblical manuscripts ever found. Archaeologists have spent decades studying those scrolls, translating them, arguing about who wrote them. But there's something else at Qumran that doesn't get much attention. Something that was there long before the scrolls. The megalithic walls. They're older than the settlement, older than the pottery and the ritual baths and the scriptorium where monks supposedly copied sacred texts. These walls were built by someone else, someone we can't identify, and they use stones that shouldn't be there. The blocks are massive. Some weigh several tons. They're fitted together with a precision that doesn't match anything else at the site. The later buildings at Qumran, the ones from the Second Temple period, are made from smaller, rougher stones, mud brick, practical construction. But these megalithic walls, they're different. Tighter joints, better engineering, different material. Geologists have tested the stone. It's not local. The nearest quarry that could have produced blocks this size is miles away, across difficult terrain. Whoever built these walls went to considerable trouble, and then at some point, later inhabitants built right on top of them, used them as foundations, incorporated them into newer structures without understanding what they were or where they came from. Most visitors to Qumran never notice. They're focused on the caves, the scrolls, the Essene community that supposedly lived there. But walk around the ruins carefully and you'll see them. Lower courses of stonework that don't match the upper layers. Blocks too precisely cut, too large, too old. Archaeologists first excavated Qumran in the 1950s. Father Roland Deveau led the dig. He was looking for evidence of the people who hid the scrolls. He found living quarters, cisterns, a complex water system. He concluded it was a monastery, a religious community that withdrew from society to live in purity and study scripture. That theory dominated for decades, but it didn't account for the walls. Deveau mentioned them in his reports, but didn't dwell on them. He assumed they were part of the same settlement, just older sections. Later archaeologists weren't so sure. The construction technique was too advanced for the period he assigned them to. The stones were too carefully shaped, and the layout didn't make sense for a monastery. Some of the megalithic sections form what looks like fortifications, thick walls, strategic positioning, the kind of thing you'd build if you expected attack. But the Essenes were pacifists. They wouldn't have needed defensive walls. And if they did, why use stones that required so much effort to move and place? Carbon dating doesn't work on stone. You can only date organic material trapped in mortar or beneath the blocks. At Qumran, there's not much to test. The walls were built dry-laid. No mortar, no cement. Just stone on stone. That means they could be hundreds of years older than the settlement around them, maybe thousands. There's another possibility that makes archaeologists uncomfortable. What if Qumran wasn't originally a monastery at all? What if it started as something else? A fortress, a trading post, maybe even a palace, and later got repurposed by the Essenes. That would explain why the megalithic walls don't match the rest of the site. They weren't built by the same people. Israeli archaeologist Yitzhak Magen spent years studying Qumran. He rejected the monastery theory entirely. He thought it was a pottery production center, a commercial operation. The water system wasn't for ritual purity, it was for manufacturing. The cisterns held water for mixing clay. The rooms weren't monastic cells, they were workshops. His theory explains some things. Qumran produced high-quality pottery, lots of it, but it still doesn't explain the megalithic walls. Why would potters need fortifications built from multi-ton stones? Then there's the earthquake. In 31 BCE, a massive quake hit the Dead Sea region. It cracked cisterns, collapsed buildings, killed people. You can still see the damage at Qumran, fractured walls, a demolished tower. But the megalithic sections, they barely shifted. Whatever technique was used to build them, it held. Through earthquakes, through 2 millennia of weather and erosion. That kind of durability takes knowledge, engineering skill, and it suggests the builders expected their work to last. This wasn't temporary, it wasn't experimental. It was built to endure. But who were they? When did they live? What were they protecting, or commemorating, or storing behind those walls? We don't know. The scrolls tell us about theology, about laws, and prayers and prophecies. They don't mention construction. Don't describe the walls, or who built them, or why. In the Brazilian state of Paraíba, there's a rock face that's covered in symbols no one can read. The Inga stone sits along the banks of the Inga River, a dark basalt outcrop stretching 75 feet long and 12 feet high. Every inch of it is carved. Spirals, circles, animals, human figures, geometric patterns that repeat and overlap and seem to follow some kind of logic. But what kind? Nobody knows. The carvings are shallow, worn smooth by centuries of weathering. Some are barely visible unless the light hits them just right. Others stand out clearly, crisp lines etched into the stone with tools that shouldn't have existed when this was made. Because the best estimates date the Inga stone to somewhere between 2,000 and 6,000 years ago, long before metal tools, long before the Portuguese arrived in Brazil. Local indigenous communities have stories about the stone. The Tupi people say it marks a sacred place, a boundary between the world of the living and the world of spirits. Some legends claim the symbols were made by the gods themselves, instructions left for humanity. Others say they're a record of the sky, constellations, planetary movements, eclipses, a celestial map carved in rock. Archaeologists have tried to decode the symbols for decades. They've catalogued more than 400 distinct figures. Some clearly represent animals, fish, birds, reptiles. Others look like humans, stick figures with exaggerated features, arms raised, legs spread, as if dancing or signaling. But the majority of the carvings are abstract, concentric circles, zigzag lines, patterns that could be decorative or could mean something specific. There's no way to tell. In the 1970s, a Spanish engineer named Francisco Pavia Alemany made a bold claim. He said the Inga stone was a Phoenician astronomical chart. He pointed to symbols that resembled ancient Mediterranean writing, argued that sailors from the eastern Mediterranean had crossed the Atlantic thousands of years before Columbus and left their mark in Brazil. He published papers, gave lectures, showed slides comparing the Inga carvings to Phoenician inscriptions. Most academics dismissed him. The similarities were superficial, cherry-picked, the kind of thing you see when you're looking for connections that aren't really there. But Alemany's theory refuses to die. It circulates online, in books about ancient mysteries, in documentaries that lean toward the speculative. Because there's something appealing about the idea, something that explains why the carvings look so deliberate, so organized, so much like a language. But if it's not Phoenician, what is it? One possibility is that it's not writing at all. Maybe the symbols are pictographic, images representing ideas rather than sounds, a visual language that doesn't correspond to any spoken tongue. That would make decoding it nearly impossible. You'd need context, cultural knowledge, access to the minds of people who've been dead for millennia. Another theory is that the Inga stone is a communal project, not the work of one artist or one group, but generations of people adding to it over centuries. That would explain the variety of styles, the overlapping images, the sense that there's no single organizing principle. Different communities, different time periods, all leaving their mark on the same rock face. But that doesn't explain the precision. Some of the carvings are incredibly detailed, perfectly symmetrical, the kind of work that requires planning, patience, skill, not something you'd expect from random additions over time. There's also the question of tools. Basalt is hard, harder than most stone. You can't carve it with wood or bone. You need something tougher, quartz maybe, or another piece of basalt used as a chisel. But experiments with those materials show that carving even a simple figure would take hours, days. The amount of labor that went into covering 75 feet of rock face would have been staggering. Why invest that much effort? What was so important about this particular spot? Some researchers think the stone marks a territorial boundary, a claim carved into the landscape. Others believe it served a ritual function, a place where ceremonies were performed, where offerings were made to spirits or ancestors. The carvings could be a record of those rituals, a permanent reminder of what happened there. Brazilian archaeologist Vanderlei de Brito Holanda has spent years studying the site. He's measured the figures, analyzed the patterns, compared them to other rock art across South America. He thinks the Inga stone is part of a larger tradition of megalithic carving that stretches across the continent. Similar symbols appear in Peru, in Colombia, in Venezuela. Different sites, different cultures, but the same basic techniques, which means whoever made the Inga stone wasn't isolated. They were part of a network, a shared culture that spanned thousands of miles. In the Spanish town of Trigueros, buried beneath a hillside, there's a corridor lined with engravings that have survived for 5,000 years, the Dolmen of Soto, a passage tomb built from massive stone slabs, some weighing over 8 tons, arranged in a straight line that runs more than 80 feet underground. And almost every surface is covered in carvings, not random scratches, deliberate symbols, repeated patterns, images that seem to tell a story we can't quite understand. The dolmen was discovered in 1922 by a local landowner who was digging on his property. He broke through the earth and found stone, then more stone, then an entrance. When archaeologists arrived, they realized what he'd stumbled onto: one of the most elaborately decorated megalithic tombs in Europe. The engravings are geometric, zigzags, checkerboard patterns, wavy lines that flow across the stone like water. There are anthropomorphic figures too, stylized humans, or maybe gods, with oversized eyes and raised arms. Some researchers think they represent deities. Others see them as shamans or ancestors. A few believe they're astronomical symbols. The problem is, without context, without a cultural framework, they could be anything. Walk through the corridor, and you're surrounded by these images. They're carved into the upright stones, the capstones, even the floor in places. Whoever built this didn't just want a functional tomb. They wanted something that communicated, that spoke to anyone who entered. The effort involved is difficult to comprehend. Carving into megalithic stone with Neolithic tools means hours of grinding, pecking, polishing. For each symbol, for each line. Multiply that by hundreds of carvings and you're looking at years of labor. And this was done before the tomb was sealed, before the dead were placed inside. Why? Why spend so much time decorating a space that would be closed off, buried, invisible? Some archaeologists think the act of carving was ceremonial, part of the burial ritual itself. The process mattered as much as the result. Creating these images honored the dead, prepared the space, transformed ordinary stone into something sacred. But there's another detail that complicates things. The carvings aren't random. They're positioned deliberately. Certain symbols appear near the entrance, others deeper inside, closer to the burial chamber. The patterns change as you move through the corridor, as if guiding you, leading you somewhere. French archaeologist Jean-Jeno studied the dolmen in the 1960s. He mapped every carving, documented their positions, looked for relationships between symbols. He noticed that some of the geometric patterns resemble maps, not of physical terrain, but of something else. Cosmological diagrams, maybe. Representations of the sky or the underworld or the journey between life and death. It's speculation, but it's informed speculation, because similar symbols appear in other megalithic tombs across Europe, in Ireland, in Brittany, in Portugal. Different sites, separated by hundreds of miles, but the same basic vocabulary: spirals, concentric circles, zigzag lines. As if these communities shared a symbolic language. How? They had no writing system, no centralized authority, no evidence of long-distance communication. And yet the patterns match, not perfectly but close enough to suggest contact, influence, or something we don't have a category for yet. The dolmen of Soto also has an astronomical alignment. The corridor points toward the winter solstice sunrise. On the shortest day of the year, light penetrates the entrance and travels the full length of the passage, illuminating the burial chamber at the far end. It only happens for a few minutes, but it happens precisely, year after year. That kind of alignment isn't accidental. Someone understood the movement of the sun, measured it, built the entire structure around it. And they did this 5,000 years ago without instruments, without mathematics as we know it. Inside the burial chamber, archaeologists found pottery, stone tools, human remains. The bones were fragmented, belonging to multiple individuals. This wasn't a single burial. It was a communal tomb, a place where generations of people were laid to rest, their remains mingling together in the darkness. But here's what's odd. The tomb was sealed around 3000 BCE, and then sometime later, it was reopened, disturbed. Items were removed, new objects were added. The stratigraphy, the layers of soil and debris, shows multiple intrusions over centuries. People kept coming back, kept interacting with this space long after the original builders were gone. Why? What drew them here? Maybe it was the carvings. Maybe the symbols retained their meaning, their power, across generations. Or maybe the tomb itself became a landmark, a sacred site that transcended its original purpose. In the Omani Desert, where temperatures reach 120 degrees. There are stone towers that have stood for 4,000 years. The Bat Necropolis, dozens of beehive-shaped tombs scattered across a barren plateau, built from carefully stacked limestone blocks, each one a monument to people whose names we'll never know. UNESCO calls it a World Heritage Site. Archaeologists call it a mystery. The tombs aren't small. Some are 30 feet in diameter, built from stones that weigh hundreds of pounds, shaped to curve inward, creating domed chambers that feel almost modern in their design. No mortar, no supports, just gravity and geometry holding them together. After 40 centuries of sandstorms, earthquakes, and scorching heat, most are still intact. The people who built them are called the al-Nar culture, named after an island near Abu Dhabi where similar tombs were first discovered. They flourished during the Bronze Age, around 2500 BCE, right when the pyramids were being built in Egypt. But unlike the Egyptians, we know almost nothing about them. No texts, no inscriptions, just their tombs and a few scattered settlements. The towers at Bat are communal. Each one held dozens of bodies, sometimes more than 100. Men, women, children, buried together without distinction. No separate chambers for royalty. No elaborate grave goods marking social hierarchy. Just people laid to rest in the darkness, their bones eventually mingling as the bodies decomposed. Danish archaeologist Peder Mortensen excavated several of the tombs in the 1970s. What he found was puzzling. Pottery, bronze weapons, jewelry made from carnelian and shells. Some of the shells came from the Indian Ocean, over 100 miles away. Others from the Persian Gulf. These people were trading, connected to networks that spanned thousands of miles. But their settlements were tiny. Mud brick buildings, simple houses. Nothing that suggests the organizational power needed to construct these massive stone tombs. Nothing that explains where the labor came from or who directed it. The tombs have another strange feature. Entrances. Multiple entrances. 3, sometimes 4 openings in each tower, positioned at cardinal points. North, south, east, west. The precision is deliberate. But why? Why not a single entrance? Why orient them so carefully? Some researchers think it's astronomical. Alignments with solstices or equinoxes. Others believe it's symbolic. The 4 directions representing the 4 corners of the world, the 4 winds, the completeness of the cosmos. Without written records, it's impossible to know. Near Bat, there are 2 other sites, Al-Qutum and Al-Ain. More towers, more tombs, the same construction techniques, but these sites have something Bat doesn't. Settlements built right next to the necropolis. You can see the foundations of houses, storage buildings, fortifications, the living and the dead side by side. That proximity is unusual. Most ancient cultures separated their burial grounds from their living spaces, kept the dead at a distance. But the al-Nar people built their homes in the shadow of these massive tombs, as if the dead were part of the community, still present, still important. Inside the tombs, archaeologists found evidence of repeated use. Bones pushed aside to make room for new bodies, offerings left and then removed. The chambers weren't sealed permanently. People kept opening them, kept adding to them. The tombs were active spaces, not just final resting places. What's remarkable is the engineering. The beehive design, corbelling it's called, requires each layer of stones to extend slightly inward, gradually closing the dome. One miscalculation and the whole structure collapses. The builders of Bat got it right. Every time. Dozens of tombs, all standing. That's not luck. That's expertise. But where did they learn it? There are no earlier prototypes, no practice tombs that show a learning curve. The technique appears fully formed, and then, around 2000 BCE, it disappears. The Umalnar culture declines. The tombs stop being built. The settlements are abandoned. By the time the next wave of people arrived in Oman, the memory of who built these towers was already gone. Climate change might be part of the answer. The Bronze Age saw periods of severe drought across the Middle East. Rivers dried up, crops failed, trade routes collapsed. Communities that depended on agriculture couldn't sustain themselves. They migrated, scattered, disappeared into history. But that doesn't explain why the towers survived when everything else vanished. Why no one came back. Why later inhabitants of the region didn't repurpose the stones or build on top of the ruins. It's as if the tombs became untouchable, forgotten but respected, left alone in the desert to weather and wait. In eastern Turkey, near the modern city of Malatya, there is a large mound rising nearly 100 feet above the surrounding plain. Its name is Arslantepe, Lion Hill. From a distance, it appears unremarkable, just a rounded rise of earth covered in grass, dust, and scattered shrubs. But beneath its surface lie the layered remains of one of the oldest known centers of organized power in human history. Excavations at Arslantepe began in the 1960s, led by Italian archaeologists from the University of Rome. What they uncovered challenged long-held ideas about how early civilizations formed. Because Arslantepe developed monumental architecture, centralized administration, and political structure before it developed writing, and before it became a true city, as we typically define one. The mound preserves occupation layers spanning nearly 6,000 years. Generations settled here, abandoned it, returned, and rebuilt it again and again. Yet the most significant period dates to around 3,400 BCE, during the late Chalcolithic, the final stage of the Copper Age. This is when an extraordinary structure was built, a palace, not a palace in the traditional royal sense. There are no throne rooms, no private royal chambers, no evidence of a divine monarch. Instead, the building was designed for storage and control. Massive rooms once held hundreds of large ceramic jars filled with grain, oil, and wine. The scale suggests something more than household storage. This was a redistribution center, a place where goods were collected, stored, recorded, and rationed across the community. Such a system implies bureaucracy, planning, oversight. Someone had to manage resources, track contributions, and control distribution. Yet writing had not been invented here. Instead, administrators used clay ceilings, small stamped impressions pressed into soft clay to mark containers and verify transactions. Hundreds of these seals have been recovered, each carved with distinct patterns of animals, geometric symbols, or human figures. These artifacts suggest an organized administrative system, an early form of government without kings and without written language. Italian archaeologist Marcella Frangipane believes Arslantepe represents a social experiment, an early attempt at centralized power based on cooperation rather than conquest. In theory, the system may have promoted fairness and stability. Communities brought surplus goods to the palace, and the central authority redistributed resources in times of need. But archaeological evidence indicates the experiment eventually failed. Around 3000 BCE, the palace was violently destroyed by fire. Walls collapsed, storage rooms were looted or burned, and within the ruins, archaeologists discovered something unexpected: weapons, not symbolic or ceremonial objects, but real instruments of war. Among them were 12 swords forged from arsenical copper, the oldest known swords ever found. These were not farming tools. They were designed for combat, balanced, sharpened, and clearly intended to kill. Their presence suggests rising conflict, either from internal unrest or external attack. Perhaps the redistribution system collapsed under economic strain. Maybe drought, famine, or political resistance destabilized cooperation. Or perhaps raiders targeted Arslantepe after recognizing the wealth concentrated within its walls. The swords may have been a final attempt to defend the palace. Whatever happened, the system did not survive. After the destruction, Arslantepe was rebuilt, but not as a palace. The new settlement was smaller, less centralized, more typical of a Bronze Age town. The grand administrative center never returned. The social experiment ended. What continues to fascinate researchers is timing. The palace at Arslantepe predates similar centralized structures in Mesopotamia. It existed before the rise of Sumerian city-states. This raises the possibility that ideas of organized authority and resource control originated in Anatolia, not solely in the river valleys of Iraq, as once believed. Yet Arslantepe did not become an empire. It did not invent writing. It did not expand or endure. Meanwhile, Mesopotamia succeeded where Arslantepe failed, developing durable institutions that shaped history for centuries. Why? Geography may have played a role. The fertile river plains offered more stable agricultural production. Cultural or religious structures may have helped legitimize authority elsewhere. Or perhaps Arslantepe simply attempted centralized power too early. We may never know. The people of Arslantepe left no written explanation, no chronicles, no names, only ash, stone, metal, and silence. Today, the mound still rises above the Anatolian plain, a quiet reminder that civilization is not guaranteed, that societies can rise, organize, experiment, and collapse before they ever learn to record their own story. In the driest desert on Earth, on a hillside in northern Chile, there's a figure that stretches 390 feet from head to toe. The Atacama Giant, a humanoid shape made from thousands of dark stones arranged on pale soil, visible for miles in every direction. It's the largest prehistoric human figure in the world, and nobody knows who made it or why. The figure is strange, geometric. The head is rectangular, topped with lines that radiate outward, like rays or feathers. The body is simplified, straight lines for limbs, minimal detail, but there are additions. Lines extending from the sides, appendages that could be arms or decorations or something symbolic. The whole thing looks more like a diagram than a person. It's old. Radiocarbon dating on organic material found near the geoglyph suggests it was created sometime between 1000 and 1400 CE. That places it in the period just before the Inca Empire expanded into this region. But the style doesn't match Inca art. It's different, older in feeling if not in actual age. The Atacama Desert is hostile, almost no rain. Temperatures that swing from freezing at night to scorching during the day. Nothing grows here except in rare spots where underground water reaches the surface. And yet people lived here, traded here, traveled through here on routes that connected the Pacific coast to the Andean highlands. The giant sits on the slope of Cerro Unita, a solitary hill rising from the desert floor. It's positioned so that anyone traveling north or south along the ancient trade routes would see it. From a distance, it dominates the landscape. Up close, the individual stones are visible. Basalt chunks, each one placed deliberately, none of them natural to this exact location. Someone carried them here, arranged them. Thousands of stones, hours of labor, maybe days. Why build something this large? If it's a marker, it's excessive. A simple cairn would have done the job. If it's religious, what kind of ritual requires a 300-foot figure? If it's territorial, who were they trying to impress? Some researchers think the giant represents a deity, a god worshipped by the people who controlled this stretch of desert. The rays coming from the head could be a crown or a halo, a symbol of divine power. The lines extending from the body might indicate movement or transformation. A god in motion, a god descending or ascending. Others see it as astronomical. The Atacama Desert has some of the clearest skies in the world. Almost no light pollution, no cloud cover. Ancient people here would have had an unobstructed view of the stars, and they paid attention. Other geoglyphs in the region align with celestial events, solstices, equinoxes, the rising of certain constellations. The giant's head points roughly north. Some archaeologists think it marks the direction of important stars. Orion, maybe, or the Southern Cross. Indigenous groups in the Andes use the stars for navigation, for calendars, for agricultural planning. A giant figure aligned with the sky could have served as a teaching tool, a permanent reminder of when to plant, when to harvest, when to move livestock to higher pastures. But there's a problem with the astronomical theory. The giant isn't aligned precisely, not the way you'd expect if accuracy mattered. It's close, but not exact. Either the builders didn't care about precision, or they were marking something else, something that didn't require mathematical perfection. Chilean archaeologist Luis Briones has studied the Atacama geoglyphs for decades. He's catalogued over 5,000 figures scattered across the desert. Animals, humans, geometric shapes. Most are much smaller than the giant. Most cluster near ancient trails, marking routes, indicating water sources, maybe serving as waypoints for travelers. Briones thinks the giant served a similar function, but on a grander scale. A landmark, a declaration. Not just, this is the way, but this is our territory. A statement of presence, of control, of identity. That makes sense in a region where resources were scarce and competition was constant. Groups fought over water, over trade routes, over the llama caravans that carried goods between the coast and the mountains. Marking your territory with the largest geoglyph ever made sends a message. We are here. We are powerful. We are not to be ignored. And then the Inca came. They absorbed the local cultures, imposed their own administration, built their own roads. The trade routes shifted. The giant stopped being relevant. It wasn't destroyed or defaced, just abandoned, left to the desert. Over the centuries, some of the stones have been displaced. Looters, erosion, careless visitors. But the figure is still recognizable, still huge, still watching over empty land. On the island of Minorca in the Mediterranean, there's a stone monument that defies easy explanation. Talati de Dalt, a taula, that's what the locals call it. The word means table in Catalan. And that's what it looks like. A massive vertical stone supporting an equally massive horizontal slab, forming a T shape that stands nearly 15 feet tall. But it's not a table, it's something else. Something we haven't quite figured out. The island is covered with these structures, over 30 of them scattered across Minorca's rocky landscape. Nowhere else in the world, just here. Built sometime between 1000 and 300 BCE. during what archaeologists call the Talaiotic period, a time when the people of Minorca were constructing monuments on a scale that seems out of proportion to their population. The Taula at Talati de Dalt is one of the best preserved. The vertical stone weighs about 5 tons, the horizontal capstone another 4. Both are limestone, quarried from somewhere on the island, shaped to fit together without mortar or metal fasteners. Just stone on stone, balanced so precisely that it stood for 3,000 years. But here's the strange part. The structure isn't stable. At least it shouldn't be. The capstone sits on top of the vertical pillar at an angle. Not flat, tilted, as if something shifted it. Earthquake, maybe, or intentional design. Some archaeologists think the tilt is original, that whoever built it wanted it this way. Off balance. Precarious. Why? What purpose does that serve? The Taula stands at the center of a horseshoe-shaped enclosure. Stone walls curve around it, forming a courtyard, open to the south, closed to the north. The arrangement suggests ritual, a sacred space, somewhere people gathered for ceremonies we can't reconstruct. British archaeologist Margaret Murray excavated Talati de Dalt in the 1930s. She found burnt animal bones, pottery shards, evidence of fire. She concluded it was a temple, a place of sacrifice. The Taula itself, she thought, represented a deity, an abstract god, masculine, powerful. The vertical stone, a symbol of strength or fertility. It's a theory, but it's just a theory because the people who built these structures left no writing, no depictions of rituals, no mythology we can access. The Taulas just stand there, mute and monumental, refusing to give up their meaning. Other researchers have different ideas. Spanish archaeologist Maria Luisa Serra Belabre suggested the Taulas were astronomical, aligned with the sun or moon. She measured the orientation of several sites and found patterns. Many face south. Some align with the winter solstice, others with the equinoxes. If she's right, the Taulas could be calendrical devices, markers for tracking seasons, for knowing when to plant or harvest, but that doesn't explain the T-shape. A simple standing stone would work just as well for astronomy. Why add the capstone? Why make it so complicated? There's another detail that bothers archaeologists. The enclosures around the Taulas contain columns, smaller stones arranged in circles or lines. Some of them still stand, others have fallen. But their placement isn't random. They're spaced evenly, deliberately, as if they supported a roof over a courtyard. That's unusual. Most ancient sacred spaces are open to the sky. Exposure to the elements is part of the ritual, part of the connection to the divine. But if Talati de Dalt had a roof, it changes the interpretation. It wasn't just an outdoor sanctuary. It was a building, a temple, in the architectural sense. The problem is, there's no evidence of roofing material, no charred wood, no clay tiles. Either the roof was made from something that completely decomposed, or it never existed. Or it existed, but was removed or destroyed so thoroughly that nothing remains. Inside the enclosure at Talati de Dalt, there's something else. A cave, a small opening in the ground that leads to a natural cavern beneath the site. Archaeologists found pottery inside, tools, more animal bones. It's clearly connected to the Taula above, part of the same complex. But how? Some think the cave was where offerings were placed, gifts to underworld deities or ancestors, a way of sending prayers or sacrifices down into the earth. Others believe it served a practical function, storage, shelter, a place for priests or participants to prepare before rituals. Then there's the question of why Menorca. Why did this island develop a unique form of megalithic architecture found nowhere else? Menorca is small, resources are limited, it's not a center of trade or power, and yet the people here invested enormous effort into building these taulas, dozens of them, each one requiring coordination, labor, skill. What were they trying to accomplish? What need did these structures fill that couldn't be met another way? We don't know. The Talaiotic culture eventually faded. The taulas were abandoned. Some were dismantled. In the mountains of eastern Algeria, there's a tomb that looks like it belongs to royalty. The Madrasan, a massive circular mound, 200 feet in diameter, rising nearly 60 feet above the surrounding plateau. It's built from limestone blocks, stacked in concentric rings, topped with a conical peak that once gleamed in the sunlight. From a distance, it dominates the landscape. Up close, it's breathtaking. This is one of the oldest monumental tombs in North Africa. Built sometime around 300 BCE, maybe earlier, before the Romans arrived, before Carthage fell. It belongs to the Numidian period, when Berber kingdoms controlled this region. Kings who ruled from horseback, who traded with Mediterranean powers, who left almost no written records behind. The design is distinctive, not quite Egyptian, not quite Phoenician, something uniquely Numidian. The outer wall is faced with carefully cut stone blocks, each one fitted tightly against the next. Above that, the mound rises in steps, a series of terraces that spiral upward. Originally, there were 60 engaged columns carved into the outer wall, decorative pillars that gave the structure an architectural elegance. Most have eroded now, weathered down to stumps, but enough remain to show the original intent. Someone wanted this tomb to impress, to last, to be remembered. The entrance is on the eastern side, a narrow doorway that leads into a corridor. The passage angles downward, cutting through the heart of the mound, descending into darkness. The walls are bare stone. No carvings, no inscriptions, just solid rock, cold and silent. At the end of the corridor, there's a chamber, small, empty. Whatever was buried here is long gone. French archaeologists opened the tomb in the 19th century. They found evidence of looting, ancient looting. The burial chamber had been ransacked, probably within a few centuries of its construction. Grave goods taken, bones scattered or removed. Nothing remained that could identify who was buried here or when exactly the tomb was built. But there are theories. The most popular is that the Madrasan was built for a Numidian king, maybe Syphax, maybe one of his predecessors. The Numidians were powerful during the 3rd century BCE. They fought alongside Carthage against Rome. They controlled vast territories across North Africa. They had the resources and the labor force to build something like this, and they had the motive. In the ancient world, tombs were statements, political statements, religious statements. A king's tomb wasn't just a place to bury a body, it was a monument to power, a way of asserting legitimacy, of connecting the ruler to divine authority, of ensuring that even in death, the king remained visible, imposing. The Madrasan achieves that. You can see it for miles. It marks the landscape, claims it, announces that someone important rests here, someone who commanded the labor of hundreds, maybe thousands, someone whose memory was supposed to endure. But memory is fragile. Within a few generations, the tomb was plundered. The treasures inside, gold, jewelry, weapons, whatever had been buried with the king, were stolen. And then, eventually, even the name was forgotten. We call it the Madrasan because that's what the local Berber population called it centuries later. But we don't know the original name, don't know who ordered it built, don't know who was laid to rest inside. The design has parallels. There's another tomb nearby, the Royal Mausoleum of Mauritania, built a couple of centuries later. It's larger, more elaborate, better preserved. And we know who's buried there: Juba II and his wife, Cleopatra Selene. A king and queen with connections to Rome, to Egypt, to the wider Mediterranean world. Their tomb follows the same basic design as the Madrasan: circular, terraced, monumental. That suggests continuity, a tradition of royal tomb building that spanned generations. The Madrasan might be the prototype, the first attempt at creating a lasting monument in a style that would define Numidian funerary architecture. But there's something else. The tomb sits on a plateau that's been occupied for thousands of years. There are Neolithic sites nearby, Bronze Age settlements. The area has always been important, strategic, maybe sacred. Building the Madrasan here wasn't just about burying a king. It was about linking that king to the deep past, to the ancestors, to the land itself. The local population has stories about the tomb, legends passed down through generations. Some say it's cursed, that anyone who disturbs it will suffer. Others claim there are hidden chambers, secret passages that lead deeper into the earth, holding treasures the looters never found. Archaeologists have scanned the structure with ground-penetrating radar. They haven't found additional chambers, but the rumors persist. In the lower Pecos region of Texas, where the Rio Grande cuts through limestone canyons, there's a rock shelter that holds one of the most complex prehistoric paintings in North America, the White Shaman mural, a sprawling composition that stretches 26 feet across the cave wall, filled with humanoid figures, animals, geometric shapes, and symbols that seem to flow together in some kind of narrative. It's at least 4,000 years old, maybe older, and we're still arguing about what it means. The shelter itself is unremarkable from the outside, just an overhang in the cliff face, protection from sun and rain. But step inside, and the walls come alive. The paintings are rendered in earth pigments: red, black, yellow, white, ochre and charcoal and minerals ground into powder, mixed with some kind of binder, applied to the rock surface with fingers or brushes made from animal hair or plant fibers. The central figure is what gives the mural its name. A white anthropomorphic shape, arms raised, body elongated. It's larger than the other figures, more prominent. Some archaeologists see it as a shaman, a spiritual leader in the midst of a trance or a ritual. Others think it's a deity, a supernatural being, or maybe it's both. Maybe in the worldview of the people who painted this, the line between human and divine was fluid. Around the white figure, there are others, smaller human shapes, animals that could be deer or dogs, abstract forms that don't correspond to anything recognizable. And then there are the dots, hundreds of them, scattered across the composition like stars or seeds or something we don't have a word for. Archaeologist Carolyn Boyd has spent years studying the White Shaman. She thinks the mural tells a creation story, a myth about the origin of the world, painted in visual language. She's compared the imagery to the mythology of the Huichol people, an indigenous group in Mexico whose oral traditions contain stories about a deer that transforms into the sun, about peyote visions, about journeys to the underworld. The parallels are striking. The Huichol live over 1,000 miles south of the lower Pecos, but their myths contain elements that seem to match what's painted on the cave wall. A deer, a shaman, a journey between worlds. Boyd thinks the ancient people of Texas shared a similar belief system, that the mural is a visual representation of a story that was told and retold for generations. It's a compelling theory, but it's controversial. Critics point out that using modern indigenous mythology to interpret ancient art is speculative, dangerous even. It assumes continuity across thousands of years and hundreds of miles. It projects beliefs onto people who can't confirm or deny them. But what's the alternative? Without written records, without oral traditions that survived, how else do we approach something this complex? We can describe what we see: figures, animals, shapes, but description isn't interpretation. And without interpretation, the mural remains just paint on rock. The people who created the white shaman were hunter-gatherers. The lower Picos region, 4,000 years ago, was semi-arid, much like today. Resources were scattered. Game was scarce. Communities were small, mobile, constantly moving to follow food and water. And yet they took time to paint, to create art that required planning, skill, pigments gathered from different locations, hours of labor. Why? What function did this serve? One possibility is that the rock shelter was a sacred site, a place where rituals were performed. The act of painting might have been part of the ritual itself. Creating the mural could have been a way of invoking spiritual power, of communicating with the supernatural, of ensuring success in the hunt, or fertility, or rain. Or maybe the mural was educational, a visual teaching tool. Stories encoded in images so they could be passed down to younger generations. A way of preserving knowledge in a culture without writing. There's also evidence of repeated use. The white shaman isn't the only painting in the shelter. There are layers, older images beneath newer ones, different styles, different time periods. People kept coming back to this spot, kept adding to the wall, kept engaging with whatever this place represented. Radiocarbon dating on pigment samples suggests the oldest layers date to around 2000 BCE. But the technique isn't precise. The samples are small. Contamination is possible. The mural could be older, could be younger. The range of uncertainty spans centuries. What we know for certain is that by the time Europeans arrived in the region, the tradition was dead. The descendants of the people who painted the white shaman had either disappeared or lost the cultural knowledge. The mural was forgotten, left to weather and fade. If you found this journey through ancient mysteries as compelling as we did, hit that like button. Share this with someone who appreciates history's unsolved puzzles. There are more stories out there, more stones, more symbols, more civilizations that vanished before anyone could ask them the questions we're asking now.